Hello, friend. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, whether you're winding down after a long day, perhaps with the glow of a screen lighting your face, or maybe you're walking under streetlights, earbuds in, letting the world fade away. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Tonight we're travelling back more than 3,000 years, to a time when the Mediterranean was not yet fully mapped, when the boundary between human and divine felt gossamer thin, and when a single war would echo through every century that followed. We're going to the Bronze Age Aegean, to a world of fortified palaces perched on hilltops, of ships with painted eyes ploughing through wine-dark seas, of kings who trace their lineage to gods, and of a 10-year siege that may or may not have happened exactly as the poets claimed, but which shaped Western civilization regardless, the Trojan War. Even saying those words conjures images: a wooden horse, Helen's face, Achilles dragging Hector's body around city walls. But tonight, we're not just visiting the greatest hits. We're going to live through the entire story, from the wedding feast where it all began, through 10 brutal years of siege warfare, to the smoking ruins and the scattered survivors who carried their memories across the known world. Picture this. It's sometime around 1200 BCE, give or take a few decades. The Late Bronze Age is in its final flowering, that last golden moment before a mysterious cascade of catastrophes will bring down nearly every major civilization from Greece to Mesopotamia. But nobody knows that yet. In the Aegean, Mycenaean Greek kingdoms control a network of palace centres, Mycenae itself, Pylos, Tiryns and others, connected by trade routes that stretch to Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and the Levant. These are not the classical Greeks of Socrates and Pericles. Those people won't exist for another 800 years. These are warriors and traders who write in an early form of Greek called Linear B, who build massive cyclopean walls, who bury their kings with gold death masks. Across the Aegean, on the coast of Anatolia, what we now call Turkey, sits Troy, or Ilion as the locals knew it. It's positioned perfectly, controlling access to the Dardanelles Strait, the narrow waterway that connects the Aegean to the Black Sea. Every ship carrying grain from the fertile lands around the Black Sea, every merchant vessel loaded with tin or amber, passes within sight of Troy's towers. The city grows wealthy on tolls and trade. Its walls rise thick and proud. Its kings forge alliances with the Hittites, the superpower to the east. Between these two worlds, Greek and Trojan, Europe and Asia, runs a fault line of ambition, trade rivalry and cultural difference. And like all fault lines, eventually the pressure builds until something breaks. The story that has come down to us is wrapped in mythology, preserved primarily in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, composed perhaps 4 or 5 centuries after any actual war might have occurred. The archaeological record gives us burned layers and broken walls, but no names, no Helen, no Achilles. Yet the story persists with such vivid detail, such geographic specificity, such human truth, that scholars have never quite been able to dismiss it entirely. Was there a Trojan War? Almost certainly there was conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and Troy. Was it exactly as Homer described? Almost certainly not. But does that matter? Here's what I believe we're really asking when we dive into the Trojan War. What happens when pride, honour, and desire collide with the machinery of kingdoms? What does a decade of violence do to the human soul? How do we remember catastrophe? And why, after more than 3 millennia, do we still tell this story around our modern campfires, our television screens, our movie theatres, our late-night podcasts like this one, that launched 1,000 ships? You'll stand beside warriors as they arm themselves at dawn, feel the Mediterranean sun beating down on bronze and leather, smell the smoke of funeral pyres. You'll meet kings and prophets, heroes and cowards, the doomed and the lucky. You'll witness clever stratagems and stupid pride, and you'll see how even the victors lost something essential in the ruins of Troy. This is not just ancient history. This is the foundational war story of Western culture, the template against which every subsequent conflict narrative has been measured. When we talk about Achilles' heel, or Trojan horses, or the face that launched 1,000 ships, we're speaking a language forged in this war. When soldiers throughout history have read Homer before battle, they were looking for something true about combat, about mortality, about the terrible glory of fighting for something larger than yourself. So settle in, get comfortable. We've got 15 parts ahead of us, and we're going to take our time. We're going to feel the weight of this story, not just rush through plot points. because the Trojan War isn't really about whether Helen was worth fighting for or whether Achilles was justified in his rage. It's about what we're willing to destroy in pursuit of honour, about how stories and truth intertwine until they're inseparable, about endings that are never as simple as victory or defeat. Now, let's begin, and to begin properly, we need to go back before the war, to a moment of celebration on a mountainside, where gods and mortals mingled, where the future seemed bright, and where three goddesses would compete for a golden apple that would set everything in motion. Every catastrophe begins with something small, a misplaced word, an uninvited guest, a choice that seems inconsequential until you look back from the ruins and realize that was the moment, that was when the door swung open and let disaster in. For Troy it began with a wedding and an apple. The bride was Thetis, a sea nymph of extraordinary beauty, one of the Nereids who dwelt in the Mediterranean's depths. The groom was Peleus, a mortal king of Phthia and Thessaly. It was an unusual match, goddess and mortal, but Thetis had caught the eye of Zeus himself, king of the gods. He desired her, so did Poseidon, god of the sea. But then came a prophecy, as prophecies always seem to arrive at inconvenient moments. Any son born to Thetis would be greater than his father. Greater, more powerful, more glorious, more dangerous. That stopped Zeus cold. The king of gods, who had overthrown his own father Cronus, who ruled from Mount Olympus by force and cunning, wasn't about to be deposed by his own offspring. So he made a decision. Thetis would marry a mortal. Let her son be greater than a mortal king. That was safe enough. The wedding took place on Mount Pelion, and it was glorious. Imagine torches blazing against the night sky, the smell of roasted meat and wine, music from lyres and flutes echoing off the mountainside. All the gods came. Zeus with his lightning, Hera his queen, Athena the grey-eyed goddess of wisdom, Aphrodite the goddess of love, Apollo with his golden lyre, Artemis the huntress, Hermes the messenger, Hephaestus the smith. They mingled with mortal heroes and kings, that razor-thin boundary between divine and human briefly erased. But one goddess wasn't invited. Eris. Discord. Strife. Her very name meant chaos, and nobody wanted chaos at a wedding feast. So they left her off the guest list, hoping she wouldn't notice or care. She noticed, and she cared. Eris arrived uninvited, invisible perhaps, or disguised, or simply brazen enough not to care about the insult. For the fairest, for the most beautiful. She rolled it into the center of the feast and disappeared. Three goddesses immediately claimed it. Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, protector of marriage and sovereignty, of course the apple was meant for her. Athena, sprung fully formed from Zeus's head, virgin goddess of wisdom, warfare and strategic thinking. Obviously she deserved it. And Aphrodite, born from sea foam, the very embodiment of beauty and desire. How could it be intended for anyone else? They argued. Gods arguing is different from mortals arguing. Reality itself bends around divine anger. The wedding feast must have grown uncomfortable, the other guests edging away, knowing that when gods fight over honour, mortals tend to get crushed in the crossfire. Zeus, wise despite his many flaws, refused to judge. He wouldn't choose between his wife, his favourite daughter, and the goddess who could make anyone fall in love with anyone. That was a losing proposition no matter who won. So he made a different choice. Let a mortal decide. Specifically, let the most beautiful mortal man decide. That would be Paris, a prince of Troy, who was said to be so handsome that even gods noticed. But here's what makes this story complex. Paris wasn't just any Trojan prince. He was the son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, born into Troy's royal family. But before his birth, Hecuba had a dream that she gave birth to a flaming torch that consumed the entire city. The prophet Cassandra, cursed to speak true prophecies that no one would ever believe, declared that the child would bring destruction to Troy. So when Paris was born, Priam ordered him abandoned on Mount Ida to die. He didn't die. A shepherd found him and raised him as his own. Paris grew up thinking he was a shepherd's son, tending flocks on the mountain slopes, playing reed pipes, living simply under the open sea. He was beautiful, yes, dark curls, strong shoulders, the kind of beauty that seemed almost divine. But he was humble, or so it seemed, unaware of his true identity. That's who Hermes found when he led the three goddesses to Mount Ida for judgment. Picture it, a young shepherd standing before three beings of impossible radiance, each offering him something in exchange for declaring her the fairest. Hera spoke first. "Choose me," she said, "and I will make you a great king. You will rule over all of Asia, command armies, live in palaces. Power, glory, dominion, all yours." Athena went next. "Choose me," she said, "and I will make you the wisest of men, the greatest warrior. You will win every battle, solve every puzzle, be remembered forever for your cunning and courage. Victory and wisdom, yours for the taking." Then Aphrodite. Her approach was different. She leaned close and her voice was like honey, like summer rain, like every beautiful thing Paris had ever wanted. "Choose me," she whispered, "and I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world, not wealth, not wisdom, love, desire fulfilled." Paris made his choice. He gave the apple to Aphrodite. Think about that moment. A young man, unaware he's choosing not just for himself but for his entire city, offered power, wisdom, or love, picks love. It's romantic in its way. It's also catastrophically stupid. Because the most beautiful woman in the world wasn't available. Her name was Helen, and she was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, one of the most powerful men in Greece. Hera and Athena departed in fury. Goddesses don't forgive easily. From that moment, they would work against Troy, patient and implacable, waiting for their revenge. Meanwhile, Aphrodite began setting her plan in motion. She revealed Paris's true identity to him, not a shepherd, but a prince. She arranged his return to Troy, where despite the old prophecy, despite Cassandra's screaming warnings that no one believed, Priam welcomed his lost son home. Paris took his place among Troy's princes, learned warfare and politics, lived in the palace that would one day burn because of his choice on a mountainside. And Aphrodite prepared Helen for her role in the story. She made sure Paris would be sent as an ambassador to Sparta. She made sure Helen and Paris would meet. She made sure, because that's what gods of love do, that when their eyes met across King Menelaus's hall, something would ignite that could not be extinguished. This is where our story really begins, not with armies or battle cries, but with a beauty contest that went wrong, with a shepherd who chose desire over wisdom, with goddesses nursing eternal grudges. The foundations of the Trojan War were laid not in strategy rooms or council chambers, but at a wedding feast where someone wasn't invited, on a mountain where a young man made a choice based on his heart rather than his head. The machinery was set in motion. All that remained was for Paris to sail to Sparta, for Helen to decide, or be compelled, to leave with him, for Menelaus to return home to find his wife and his honour gone. And then the ships would gather. The heroes would arm themselves. The greatest war of the ancient world would begin, but that's next. For now, remember this. Wars don't start themselves. They start with choices, with pride, with desire, with old resentments festering until they poison everything. They start small and grow monstrous. They start with a golden apple rolling across a floor while gods and mortals watch, not realizing they're witnessing the first domino beginning to fall. Before Helen was married, before she chose Menelaus from among her many suitors, there was a problem. Every unmarried prince and king in Greece wanted her. She was that beautiful. Beauty that wasn't just physical, but seemed to carry some quality of the divine. As if Aphrodite herself had blessed this mortal woman. Some versions of the story say Zeus was her true father, having come to her mother Leda as a swan. Whether that's literally true doesn't matter. What matters is that everyone believed Helen was special, and everyone wanted her. Her earthly father, King Tyndareus of Sparta, had a dilemma. Helen could only marry one man, but there were dozens of suitors camped outside his palace, armed, proud, and dangerous. Choose one, and the others might declare war. Reject them all, and they definitely declare war. It was the sort of impossible situation that could tear Greece apart before any foreign enemy lifted a sword. That's when Odysseus, young king of Ithaca, proposed a solution. He was already known for his cleverness, though his greatest exploits still lay ahead of him. Odysseus wasn't actually interested in Helen himself. He had his eye on her cousin Penelope, but he could see the political catastrophe brewing. So he suggested something brilliant and terrible in its implications. Make all the suitors swear an oath. The oath of Tyndareus, it came to be called. Every man who sought Helen's hand would swear to accept her choice of husband, and more importantly, swear to defend that husband's rights if anyone ever tried to steal her away or challenge the marriage. They would bind themselves by the most sacred vows, calling down the wrath of gods if they broke their word. In Greek culture, such oaths weren't casual promises. They were bonds that reached into the fabric of reality itself. One by one, the suitors swore. Menelaus, brother of the powerful King Agamemnon of Mycenae, Odysseus of Ithaca, Ajax of Salamis, huge and powerful, Diomedes of Argos, young but fierce, Idomeneus of Crete, Patroclus, who came with his companion Achilles, though Achilles himself was too young to be a suitor. Dozens more, representing nearly every significant kingdom in Greece. They cut the throat of a horse, stood in its blood, and swore their oath over the steaming carcass. Helen chose Menelaus. Perhaps she loved him. Or perhaps it was politics. His brother Agamemnon was the most powerful king in Greece, and marriage to Menelaus meant alliance with that power. Either way, she became queen of Sparta, and the other suitors dispersed to their kingdoms, bound by oath, but probably believing they'd never have to honour it. For a few years there was peace. Helen and Menelaus ruled Sparta. They had a daughter, Hermione. Life seemed settled. The oath was forgotten, just words spoken over a dead horse, assurance that would never need to be claimed. Then Paris arrived. King Priam sent his son as an ambassador, ostensibly to negotiate trade routes or diplomatic niceties, but Aphrodite was guiding events. When Paris entered Menelaus's hall and saw Helen for the first time, the goddess made sure that her promise on Mount Ida would be fulfilled. Some ancient sources say Aphrodite cast a spell on Helen, made her fall helplessly in love with this foreign prince. Others say Helen was always restless in her marriage, always aware that she'd been passed around like property, that her choice of Menelaus had really been a choice of political safety rather than passion. Maybe she saw in Paris something she'd never had, genuine desire for her as a person, not as a prize. What happened next is disputed. The traditional story says Paris abducted Helen while Menelaus was away in Crete for a funeral, but some ancient sources suggest Helen went willingly, perhaps even eagerly. The Iliad itself is ambiguous, sometimes treating her as a victim, sometimes as a willing participant who nevertheless regrets her choice. The truth, as often happens in these ancient stories, probably lies somewhere complicated in between. Desire and coercion, choice and compulsion, all tangled together. What's certain is this. Paris and Helen sailed from Sparta to Troy, taking with them not just Helen, but a substantial portion of Menelaus's treasure. When Menelaus returned home to find his wife and his wealth gone, his honour destroyed before all of Greece, he didn't hesitate. He went straight to his brother. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, was the most powerful man in Greece. His palace was legendary. Those massive walls built with stones so large that later Greeks thought giants must have built them. He commanded loyalty or fear from most of the other kingdoms. He was proud, ambitious, and absolutely furious at the insult to his family. If a foreign prince could steal a Greek queen with impunity, what did that say about Greek power? What did it say about the sanctity of marriage, of hospitality, of the fundamental rules that held civilization together? Agamemnon saw opportunity in the crisis. Yes, he wanted revenge for his brother, but he also wanted to unite the fractious Greek kingdoms under his leadership, and what better cause than retrieving a stolen queen? He sent messengers to every kingdom reminding them of their oath, the oath of Tyndareus. They had sworn to defend Menelaus's marriage rights. Now that oath was being called in. One by one, reluctantly or eagerly, the kings and princes of Greece began to respond. Some came willingly. Ajax of Salamis brought 12 ships immediately, eager for glory. Diomedes of Argos came with 80 ships, already a formidable warrior despite his youth. Idomeneus brought the Cretan fleet. Nestor, the aged king of Pylos, came with 90 ships and a lifetime of wisdom from previous wars. But others tried to avoid their oath. Most famously, Odysseus feigned madness. When the messengers arrived at Ithaca, they found him ploughing a field and sowing it with salt, acting like a madman. Odysseus had just married Penelope, had an infant son named Telemachus, and had no desire to leave his island kingdom for a war that might last years. The messengers, led by Palamedes, placed baby Telemachus in front of Odysseus's plough. Odysseus immediately stopped, revealing his sanity. He couldn't let the blade harm his son. Caught in his deception, Odysseus had no choice but to honour his oath. Then there was Achilles. He hadn't sworn the oath. He was too young when Helen married, but Agamemnon needed him. A prophecy declared that Troy could not fall without Achilles. His mother, Thetis, remember the sea nymph whose wedding had started this whole chain of events, knew another prophecy. If Achilles went to Troy, he would win eternal glory but die young. If he stayed home, he would live a long, peaceful, forgotten life. Knowing this, Thetis hid her son on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl among the king's daughters. Odysseus found him. The clever king arrived at Skyros with a merchant's cart full of gifts, jewellery, fine cloth, cosmetics for the royal daughters. But hidden among the women's goods was a sword and a spear. When Odysseus arranged for a false alarm of attack, all the real girls scattered. The girl, who grabbed the weapons and stood ready to fight, was Achilles. Exposed, he agreed to join the expedition, bringing with him his companion Patroclus and his elite warriors, the Myrmidons. The gathering point was Aulis, a harbour on the eastern coast of Greece. For months ships arrived. Eventually over 1,000 vessels crowded the bay. Homer would later call them the 1,000 ships, though some ancient catalogues list the fleet at 1,186 ships specifically. Each ship carried anywhere from 20 to 50 warriors, plus rowers. The army gathering at Aulis numbered perhaps 50,000 men, an unimaginable force for the Bronze Age world. But they couldn't sail. The winds refused to blow. Day after day, the fleet sat becalmed while provisions dwindled and men grew restless. The seer Calchas delivered terrible news. The goddess Artemis was angry with Agamemnon. Some versions say he'd killed one of her sacred deer. Others say he'd boasted he was a better hunter than the goddess. Either way, she would not release the winds until Agamemnon sacrificed what he held most dear, his daughter Iphigenia. What happened next reveals everything about the kind of men who would fight this war, about the cost of honour and ambition. Agamemnon sent word to his wife Clytemnestra, asking her to bring Iphigenia to Aulis, claiming she would be married to Achilles, a great honour. Clytemnestra came, bringing their daughter, expecting a wedding. Instead, Agamemnon took Iphigenia to Artemis's altar and slit her throat while his army watched. The winds came, the fleet could sail. But Clytemnestra would never forgive. She returned to Mycenae carrying hatred that would outlast the war itself, already planning the revenge she would take when, if Agamemnon returned home. The 1,000 ships departed Aulis, rowing and sailing across the Aegean toward Troy. It took them weeks, stopping at islands for water and supplies, losing their way, encountering obstacles. At one point they accidentally landed at Mysia and fought a battle against King Telephus, who wounded Achilles and was wounded in return. They had to turn back, regroup and try again, but eventually they reached the coast of the Troad, the region surrounding Troy. They beached their ships on the plain between the city and the sea. They set up camp, built defensive walls around their ships, prepared for siege. And they looked up at Troy's walls, massive and seemingly impregnable, and must have wondered, how long would this take? How many would die? Would they ever see home again? Inside Troy, King Priam called his council. Paris stood before them, Helen at his side. Some councillors argued for returning her immediately, apologising, avoiding war. Hector, Priam's eldest son and heir, argued most forcefully for this option. But Paris refused. And Priam, despite knowing the prophecy about his son's birth, despite his daughter Cassandra screaming that Troy would burn, chose to stand by his son. The line was drawn, Greek and Trojan, the oath-bound army and the city that would not yield. The stage was set for a war that would consume 10 years, destroy countless lives, and echo through every century that followed. Both sides knew, in that moment before the first spear was thrown, that there would be no easy victory, no quick resolution. This would be a grinding, brutal conflict that would test courage, honour, and the very limits of human endurance. They were right, but they couldn't imagine just how terrible that truth would be. The war began with optimism, if you can call it that, not joy exactly. Nobody was foolish enough to celebrate the prospect of mass slaughter, but certainly confidence. The Greeks had numbers, heroes, prophecy on their side. Troy had walls, allies, and Hector. Both sides assumed it would be settled relatively quickly. A few pitched battles, some individual combats between champions. Eventually Troy would surrender Helen and treasure, or the Greeks would breach the walls. Either way, home by winter. 10 years later, they'd still be fighting. The first year established the pattern. The Greeks couldn't simply assault Troy's walls. Those massive fortifications, built in a previous age and strengthened over generations, were too formidable. A direct assault would cost thousands of lives and probably fail. So instead, they settled into siege, surrounding the city to cut off supplies and allies. But Troy had its own wells, grain stores, livestock within the walls. It could last years if necessary. So the war became something strange. Not a siege in the medieval sense, with siege engines and starvation tactics, but a long series of raids, skirmishes, and occasional pitched battles. The Greeks would send out raiding parties to attack Troy's allies, the small cities and kingdoms that supported Priam, that sent food and warriors to Troy's defence. Knock out the allies, isolate Troy, eventually force surrender. This meant the Greek heroes spent years fighting wars that had nothing to do with Helen or honour or prophecy. They attacked Thebe, a city ruled by King Eetion, Andromache's father. Achilles led that raid. He killed Eetion and his 7 sons, took the city's wealth, captured women as slaves and concubines. One of those captives was Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo. Agamemnon claimed her as his war prize. They attacked Lyrnessus, more slaughter, more captives. This time Achilles claimed a young woman named Briseis, of the beautiful cheeks, as Homer calls her, treating her well enough that she became genuinely attached to him, as much as any captive could be to her captor. They raided Lesbos, Tenedos, and dozens of other places. Some cities resisted and were destroyed. Others surrendered immediately and were merely plundered. The pattern became routine. Sail or march to a target, attack at dawn, kill the men, take the women and children, burn what couldn't be carried, return to camp with loot. This is what war actually looks like, stripped of heroic poetry. Not glorious combat between champions, but economically motivated violence against civilians, designed to cripple an enemy's resource base. The Trojan War, in its middle years, was less a clash of armies than an extended campaign of terror and plunder against the Troad's countryside and allied cities. Meanwhile, occasional battles erupted between the main Greek and Trojan forces. These followed a ritualized pattern. Warriors would arm themselves at dawn, bronze greaves on their shins, bronze breastplate, sword at side, spear in hand, helmet with its horsehair crest, massive round shield. They'd march out onto the plain between the Greek ships and Troy's walls. The Trojans would emerge from their gates in their own formations. The armies would face each other, shouting insults and boasts. Then champions would step forward. Single combat between the greatest warriors, while both armies watched. This served multiple purposes. It satisfied honour, provided entertainment, demonstrated divine favour, the gods were believed to decide such duels, and kept casualties relatively low. If Ajax fought Hector to a draw, both sides could claim something without losing hundreds of soldiers. But sometimes the single combats escalated. Tempers flared, someone threw a spear at the wrong moment, and the formations would charge, crashing together in a chaos of bronze and blood and screaming. Men stumbled over bodies. Spears shattered, swords rang against shields. The wounded crawled toward their own lines, leaving trails in the dust. The dead were left where they fell until one side or the other retreated, and then heralds would arrange truces to collect and burn the bodies. The funeral rites became their own ritual. Bodies were collected, washed, anointed with oil. Wood was gathered for pyres, an increasing challenge. As the years passed and the local forests were depleted, the dead were cremated with honour, their ashes collected in urns, mounds raised over them. Both sides observed these rituals scrupulously. You could slaughter each other all day, but you didn't deny an enemy his funeral rites. That was the kind of sacrilege that brought divine punishment. Gradually, a structure emerged to the siege. Not exactly stability, men were still dying regularly, but a kind of routine. The Greek camp became a semi-permanent settlement. Huts were built, supply lines established with Greece, ships rotated back and forth, bringing fresh warriors and food, taking home the wounded and war-weary. Some men served for months, others for years. A few, like Achilles and Odysseus and Ajax, stayed for the duration. Leadership hierarchies solidified. Agamemnon was commander-in-chief, his authority backed by Mycenae's wealth and power. But he had to negotiate constantly with the other kings, who were technically allies rather than subordinates. Nestor, too old to fight much but invaluable for his diplomatic skills, served as counsellor. Odysseus was the strategist, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Ajax was the rock, the immovable warrior who could anchor a defensive line. And Achilles was the weapon, the warrior everyone feared, whose reputation grew with each raid, who seemed almost superhuman in combat. On the Trojan side, Priam ruled from his palace, but increasingly he deferred to his sons. Hector was the true military leader, commander of Troy's forces, the hero who fought daily to defend his city. He was everything a Bronze Age warrior king should be: brave, strong, honourable, devoted to family and city. Paris, despite being the cause of the war, was considered the lesser warrior, better with a bow than in close combat, more lover than fighter. The other sons of Priam, Deiphobus, Helenus, Polydorus, fought alongside Hector. Troy's allies sent contingents, Sarpedon, from Lycia, grandson of Zeus himself, leading his warriors, Aeneas, son of Aphrodite and Anchises, commanding the Dardanians, Rhesus from Thrace. Memnon would come later, from far Ethiopia, bringing exotic warriors. The years blurred together. 9 years of this pattern. Raids, skirmishes, occasional major battles, funerals, temporary truces, strategy sessions, arguments among the leaders. The war that was supposed to be quick became generational. Warriors who arrived as young men grew into their prime. The older soldiers aged beyond their fighting years. Odysseus' son Telemachus grew from infant to boy, not knowing his father. Hector's wife Andromache raised their son Astyanax, living with constant fear that each day might bring news of her husband's death. The Greeks grew frustrated. They were winning, slowly grinding down Troy's allies, accumulating wealth from raids, but the city itself remained unconquered. Its walls stood. Hector still emerged each morning to lead the defense. The prophecies spoke of Troy's eventual fall, but when? How many more years? How many more men would die on this foreign shore so far from home? The Trojans grew exhausted. They couldn't leave their city. The countryside that had supported them was devastated. Their allies were weakening or destroyed. They were slowly being strangled, but they couldn't surrender. Helen was one person, but giving her up now would mean admitting they'd sacrificed 9 years, thousands of lives for nothing. Pride and honor were chains as strong as the walls that protected them, and the gods watched, choosing sides, interfering when it suited them. Athena and Hera favored the Greeks, still nursing their grudge from Paris's judgment. Aphrodite protected Paris and Helen, ensuring the war continued. After all, she'd promised Paris the most beautiful woman, and she kept her promises. Consequences be damned. Apollo favored Troy, angered by Agamemnon's treatment of his priest. Poseidon's loyalty shifted. Zeus tried to remain neutral but couldn't help favoring individual heroes he admired or was related to. The gods' meddling extended the war, saved heroes who should have died, killed warriors who should have survived, all according to their whims and feuds. By the 9th year, both sides were locked in a kind of mutual exhaustion. Too much had been sacrificed to stop. Too many dead demanded that their deaths have meaning. The Greeks couldn't go home empty-handed, having lost thousands for nothing. The Trojans couldn't surrender, having endured 9 years of siege only to yield at the end. The war had become its own justification, a terrible machine that consumed lives and honor and innocence, that nobody could figure out how to stop. The stage was set for the 10th year, the year when everything would change, when pride and rage would nearly destroy the Greek effort from within, when the greatest warrior would withdraw from battle, and Troy would almost drive the invaders into the sea, when the personal tragedy at the war's heart would finally reach its climax. But we're not there yet. For now, understand this. The Trojan War in its middle years wasn't the stuff of heroic poetry. It was dirty, grinding, economically driven conflict. It was widows and orphans. It was burned villages and enslaved populations. It was warriors growing old before their time, wondering what they were fighting for, watching their friends die for reasons that seemed increasingly abstract. This is what consolidation looks like in war. Not grand strategy, but grim persistence. Not heroism, but survival. Not glory, but the terrible human capacity to adapt to horror until it becomes routine. In the 10th year of the war, something shifted. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the sense that this had to end, one way or another. But suddenly, the conflict intensified. The great heroes on both sides began to push harder, fight more fiercely, take greater risks. The Greeks call these moments aristeia, a warrior's finest hour when he fights beyond human limits, when glory and death dance so close together they're almost indistinguishable. This is when the Trojan War becomes the story we remember, not the grinding 9 years of raids and skirmishes, but this explosive final year when heroes burned brightest before burning out. Start with Diomedes. He was young, too young to have been one of Helen's original suitors, but already fearsome. King of Argos, he'd brought 80 ships to Troy, proven himself again and again in combat. But in the 10th year, during one particular battle, Athena blessed him with special sight. She let him see the gods themselves as they moved among the armies, meddling and protecting their favourites. Picture Diomedes that day, blood spattered, tireless, cutting through Trojan lines like a force of nature. He killed Pandrus, Troy's best archer. He wounded Aeneas so badly that Aphrodite herself swooped down to rescue her son. When the goddess tried to carry Aeneas to safety, Diomedes, think about this, attacked her. He thrust his spear into Aphrodite's wrist. Ichor, the golden blood of gods, spilled onto the battlefield. The goddess of love fled to Olympus, wounded by a mortal. Then Diomedes turned his spear on Ares, god of war himself. With Athena's help, he drove his bronze point into the war god's belly. Ares shrieked. Homer says the scream of a wounded god sounds like 9,000 or 10,000 men screaming at once, and fled to Olympus to complain to Zeus about this upstart mortal who dared wound gods. For that one day Diomedes fought at a level beyond human. It couldn't last. No mortal could sustain that intensity. But while it did, he was unstoppable. That's what an Aristeia is, the moment when a hero transcends limitations, when poetry becomes reality, when you understand why these stories survived 3,000 years. Ajax had his moments too. Ajax the Greater, they called him, to distinguish him from Ajax the Lesser of Locris. He was huge, a wall of muscle and bronze, carrying a shield like a tower, fighting with patience and terrible strength. Where Achilles was speed and fury, Ajax was endurance. You didn't defeat Ajax. You wore yourself out against him and died tired. In one battle, he held the line single-handedly while the Greek army retreated, stepping backwards slowly, his shield deflecting every spear, his arm never tiring. He was the army's foundation, the one who never broke. Odysseus had different strengths. He wasn't the largest or the fastest, but he was clever and dangerous in close combat. In one raid, he and Diomedes infiltrated the Trojan camp at night, killed Rhesus the Thracian king in his sleep, and stole his magnificent white horses. The operation was brutal, efficient, morally questionable, pure Odysseus. He understood that wars aren't won only on the battlefield, but through intelligence, sabotage, and the willingness to do necessary ugliness. On the Trojan side, Hector was the soul of the defence. Every morning he armed himself, kissed his wife Andromache and their baby son Astyanax goodbye, and led Troy's warriors out to face the Greek army. He knew the prophecies. He knew Troy would fall, but he fought anyway, because what else could he do? His city needed him. His father trusted him. His brothers looked to him. So he fought with a kind of doomed magnificence, buying Troy more time, more days, more moments of life before the inevitable end. There's a scene in the Iliad where Hector returns home briefly during the battle. He finds Andromache on the city walls clutching their baby. She begs him not to return to the fighting. She reminds him that Achilles killed her father and brothers, that Hector is all she has left. If he dies, she'll be enslaved, their son killed or sold. She begs him to fight defensively, from the walls, to value his life and theirs above glory. Hector's response reveals everything about heroic culture. He knows she's right. He knows he's probably going to die. But shame before his fellow Trojans matters more than safety. He can't hide behind walls while others fight for his city. He reaches for his son, but the baby cries at the sight of his father's helmet with its horsehair plume. Hector laughs, removes the helmet, holds his son, prays to Zeus that Astyanax will grow to be a great warrior. Then he gives the boy back to Andromache, returns the helmet to his head, and walks back to the battle. That's the tragedy at the war's heart. These men knew they were trapped. Honor demanded they fight. Love demanded they survive. They couldn't do both, so they chose honor, knowing what it would cost. Sarpedon, grandson of Zeus, had his Aristeia too. He led the Lycian contingent, fought brilliantly, and for a while seemed divinely protected. His men loved him. He was brave, generous, thoughtful, everything a king should be. Before one battle, he gave a speech that became famous. "We fight," he told his warriors, "because we're given honor, wealth, and the best of everything by our people. In exchange, we stand in the front rank when danger comes. That's the bargain of leadership." Zeus watched his grandson fight and wanted to save him. Here's where the story becomes almost unbearably human in its divine dimension. Zeus, king of gods, father of Sarpedon, had the power to alter fate and save his son. But Hera stopped him. "Save Sarpedon," she argued, "and every other god will want to save their favourite mortals. Fate will become meaningless. The war will never end." Zeus wept tears of blood, but he let his son die. Patroclus killed Sarpedon with a spear thrust. The battle over his body was ferocious. both sides fighting to control the corpse. Finally, Zeus sent Apollo to rescue Sarpedon's body, clean it, anoint it with ambrosia, and have Sleep and Death carry it back to Lythia for proper burial. Even in grief there were proprieties to observe. This was warfare at its most terrible and most glorious. Not the raids and ambushes of the Middle Years, but direct confrontation between the best warriors of both sides, fighting in full view of their armies, with the gods themselves watching and occasionally intervening. Men fought knowing they might die, but also knowing their deeds would be remembered. Homer would preserve their names, singers would carry their stories across generations. That was the prize that made death bearable. Undying glory, kleos, the fame that outlasts the body. The Greeks had been promised prophecies. Troy would fall, but only if certain conditions were met. They needed Achilles. They needed the bow of Heracles, carried by Philoctetes, who'd been abandoned on an island years earlier due to a festering wound, but would later be retrieved. They needed Neoptolemus, Achilles' son. They needed the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena kept in Troy's temple. The prophecies were specific, complex, suggesting that victory would require not just military strength, but cunning, divine favour and specific symbolic actions. But beneath all the Aristeia and heroic combats, beneath the poetry and glory, real horror accumulated. The casualty lists grew, the funeral pyres never stopped burning. Women in both Greece and Troy lived in constant fear. Slaves and captives endured things Homer mostly doesn't describe. The countryside around Troy became a wasteland. Forests cut down for funeral pyres and siege works, fields trampled, villages destroyed. Yet this is when the war was at its most vivid, most alive. This is what people remember about the Trojan War. Not the grinding siege, but these explosive moments of heroism, sacrifice, and tragic beauty. Warriors fighting at the absolute peak of human capability, knowing death was likely but glory was certain. It couldn't last. Intensity like that burns out. But while it did, while the heroes had their Aristeia, while men fought like gods and gods bled like men, the Trojan War became something more than a territorial dispute or a husband's revenge. It became the template for how Western culture would imagine heroism itself. Beautiful, doomed, worth the cost even when the cost was everything. The flourishing, when it came, was brief and brilliant and utterly devastating. Like a candle burning brightest just before it goes out. Let's talk about how this actually worked. Not the grand, sweeping poetry of heroes dueling before the walls, but the logistics. The daily mechanics of maintaining an army of tens of thousands of men on a foreign shore for a decade. Because wars aren't fought by heroes alone, they're sustained by systems, by the unglamorous labour of keeping warriors fed, armed, and motivated year after year. The Greek camp was a city itself. Imagine over 1,000 ships pulled up on the beach, arranged in a great arc along several miles of coastline. Each contingent had its own section, the Myrmidons of Achilles here, the Salaminians of Ajax there, the Pylians of old Nestor in another section. Between the ships, they built a defensive wall and ditch to protect against Trojan counterattacks. The wall wasn't particularly impressive by Bronze Age standards, but it served its purpose, a barrier that would slow any assault and give the Greeks time to organise defence. Behind that wall sprawled the camp proper, huts built from timber, stone and whatever materials could be scavenged, cooking fires sending up smoke columns that could be seen from Troy's walls, armories where bronze weapons were stored, repaired, sharpened, areas for sacrifice no major decision was made without consulting the gods through burnt offerings and reading omens, training grounds where warriors practiced with spear and sword. Food was the perpetual problem. An army of 50,000 needs massive quantities of grain, meat, wine, and water. They couldn't live off the land. They'd strip the local area bare within the first year. So supply ships ran constantly between Greece and Troy, bringing provisions. This required an entire administrative structure. Clerks to track supplies, overseers to manage distribution, guards to prevent theft. It was boring, essential work that nobody writes poems about, but without which the army would have collapsed. Fresh water came from the rivers that flowed down from Mount Ida to the sea. The Scamander and the Simois, both rivers mentioned frequently in Homer, because water access was life and death. Control the rivers, and you control whether the army can survive. There were probably constant skirmishes over water rights, guards posted at collection points, rules about who could draw water when. Medical care was primitive but present. Warriors wounded in battle were dragged back to camp, where the best anyone could do was clean the wound, Perhaps burn it with hot metal to prevent infection, bandage it, and pray. If a major artery was cut or the wound became infected, you died. Simple as that. Some warriors carried rudimentary medical knowledge. Achilles, for instance, was said to have been taught healing by the centaur Chiron. Machaon and Podalirius, sons of the healing god Asclepius, served as the army's physicians. But Bronze Age medicine was more prayer than practice. The distribution of spoils required its own system. When a city was raided and plundered, the wealth had to be divided. There were rules, customs, hierarchies. The commander-in-chief got first choice, then the other kings in order of status and contribution, then the lesser nobles, finally the common soldiers. Wealth meant not just gold and bronze, but also livestock, weapons, cloth, and human captives. Women especially were valued as labourers, concubines, or potential ransom. This system was supposed to maintain morale by ensuring everyone got a share, but it was also a constant source of conflict. Religion permeated everything. Before battle, sacrifices were made. After battle, thank offerings were given to whichever god seemed responsible for victory. Seers like Calchas interpreted bird flights, examined animal entrails, read thunder and lightning. No major military decision happened without divine consultation. This wasn't superstition to them. It was practical reality. The gods were real, active forces that could turn the tide of battle. Ignore them at your peril. The command structure was complex because the Greek army wasn't really unified. Agamemnon was primus inter pares, first among equals. He commanded the largest contingent and had the most political power, but technically each king was sovereign over his own forces. This meant every major decision required a council meeting where kings and princes would argue, debate, sometimes nearly come to blows. Nestor spent half his time mediating disputes, reminding everyone why they were there, invoking past glories to shame them into cooperation. These councils followed ritual patterns. A herald would call the assembly. A speaker would stand holding the scepter, the symbol of authority, to speak. Others would listen, in theory. In practice, there was constant interruption, insult, and near violence. But the system worked just well enough. Decisions were made. The army functioned. Barely. Communication was another challenge. How do you coordinate movements of 50,000 men without radios, phones, or even reliable messenger systems? Mostly through visual signals, flags or shields raised in certain patterns. Trumpet calls, different notes meant different commands. Runners sprinting between contingents. It was crude, which meant tactics had to be relatively simple. Complex maneuvers were nearly impossible. Mostly you formed up, marched toward the enemy, crashed together, and the side with better warriors won. Armour and weapons required constant maintenance. Bronze is softer than iron. Iron weapons wouldn't become common for another few centuries. Bronze swords bent, bronze spearheads broke, shields split. All of it needed repair or replacement. Each contingent had smiths who worked from dawn to dusk, hammering bronze back into shape, fitting new leather straps to shields, sharpening blade. Leather armour made from layered ox hide rotted in the Mediterranean climate and needed constant replacement. A warrior's panoply represented enormous wealth and effort. Lose it in battle, and you were essentially useless until you could acquire another set. The social hierarchy was rigid. At the top were the heroes, the named warriors, sons of kings, men whose deeds would be remembered. Below them were the common soldiers, farmers and craftsmen conscripted or hired to fight. Below them were slaves, captive, and labourers who did the actual heavy work of maintaining the camp. And below even them were the non-combatants, women and children captured in raids, kept for labour or eventual ransom. Women had specific roles in the camp. High-status captive women, like Briseis and Chryseis, became concubines to the heroes, living in their huts, serving them, bearing the strange liminal status of honoured slave. They had some protection, some privilege, but no freedom. Lower-status women did laundry, cooked, drew water, all the domestic labour an army requires. Some were skilled in weaving or other crafts that produced valuable trade goods. Their labour was essential, but they remained invisible in the heroic poetry. Entertainment was necessary for morale. Warriors couldn't spend every day fighting, they'd go mad or mutiny. So there were games, wrestling, boxing, spear-throwing contests, foot races, chariot races. There was gambling, drinking, storytelling. Singers would perform, accompanying themselves on the lyre, recounting old glories or recent battles. These performances served multiple functions: entertainment, cultural memory, moral instruction, and reinforcement of heroic values. They were the news, history lesson, and Netflix all rolled into one. Justice and discipline were enforced through a mix of formal rules and personal authority. If a common soldier committed a crime, theft, assault, desertion, his commander would judge and punish him. Punishments ranged from beatings to execution, depending on severity and the commander's mood. But if the conflict involved two heroes or two contingents, things got complicated. Who had authority over whom? These disputes could paralyze the army, which is exactly what would happen when Agamemnon and Achilles clashed. Time was marked differently than we mark it. No calendars counted down the days. Seasons mattered. You couldn't campaign effectively in winter when storms made sea travel impossible. So there was a rhythm. Intense activity in spring, summer, and early fall, then relative quiet in winter, when both sides huddled and endured. The length of the siege was measured in these cycles. 9 years meant 9 springs watching Troy's gates open, 9 summers of combat, 9 autumns of preparing for winter, 9 winters of cold and frustration. Troy had its own systems. The city was smaller, more concentrated, but also more sophisticated in some ways. Centuries of urban development meant better organization, better infrastructure. Wells, granaries, workshops, temples, all within the protective circuit of those legendary walls. The population was mixed. Native Trojans, allies from across Anatolia, refugees from towns the Greeks had destroyed, slaves, merchants who'd been trapped when the siege began. Priam's palace complex dominated the citadel. From there he ruled with his sons and councillors, making daily decisions about rationing, defence, diplomacy. They sent messengers to allies calling for reinforcements. They negotiated with the Greeks through heralds during truces, trying to find terms that would end the siege without total surrender. They failed, always, because neither side could find acceptable middle ground. Troy's advantage was its walls and its ability to sally out when advantageous. The Greeks couldn't maintain a complete blockade. Troy had gates on multiple sides, and the defenders could sortie to gather supplies from nearby areas the Greeks couldn't fully control. But the Trojans couldn't leave for long. They were essentially imprisoned in their own city, watching their allies destroyed one by one, waiting for either Greek exhaustion or their own collapse. The economics of the siege were grinding both sides down. The Greeks were spending enormous resources, ships, supplies, men, on an objective that had stopped being about Helen years ago. This was about pride, about the sunk cost fallacy writ large. We've invested 9 years. We can't quit now. For Troy, the calculation was even worse. Every year of resistance meant more devastation of the surrounding territory, more allies lost, more isolation. But surrender meant humiliation, probable execution for Paris and perhaps other royal family members, slavery for many citizens. There was no good option. This is how wars sustain themselves, through systems that become routine, through hierarchies that give people defined roles, through the sheer momentum of established patterns. You keep fighting not because you remember why you started, but because stopping would mean admitting the last 9 years were wasted. The machinery of the Trojan War, the logistics, the labour, the organisation, was unglamorous but essential. Heroes don't fight on empty stomachs. They can't duel without weapons. They won't risk their lives without reward. The systems held it all together, creating the conditions where heroism was possible, but also ensuring the war would grind on year after year, consuming lives in both spectacular individual deaths and quiet anonymous suffering. This was the foundation beneath the poetry, the boring, brutal reality that made the glory possible. The 10th year began with plague. The Greeks woke one morning to find men dying, not from wounds but from fever and sickness that spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. Bodies piled up faster than they could be burned. The funeral pyres never went out. For 9 days the plague ravaged the army while everyone wondered which god had they offended. Calchas the seer finally revealed the truth, but only after Achilles promised to protect him from Agamemnon's wrath. The plague came from Apollo, angered because Agamemnon had dishonoured one of his priests. Remember Chryseis, the captive girl Agamemnon claimed after the raid on Thebe? Her father, Chryses, was a priest of Apollo. He'd come to the Greek camp with ransom, begging for his daughter's return. Agamemnon refused brutally, drove him away with insults. So Chryses prayed to Apollo, and the god sent plague arrows into the Greek camp. Invisible death falling from a clear sky. The solution was obvious. Return Chryseis to her father, make amends to Apollo. But Agamemnon's pride was wounded. If he gave up his prize, he'd look weak before the entire army. So he agreed to return Chryseis, but only if he received compensation. He looked at Achilles and said, "I'll take yours." Understand what this meant. Briseis wasn't just a captive to Achilles. Yes, he'd claimed her as a war prize, but over time something had developed. Not love exactly, or maybe love of a complicated sort given the power dynamics, but attachment. She'd lost everything, her city, her family, and Achilles had treated her well, given her status and protection. Now, Agamemnon was taking her simply because he could, because his authority as commander-in-chief gave him the right to override the system everyone had agreed to. Achilles reached for his sword. Picture the moment, his hand on the hilt, face contorted with rage, Agamemnon standing there imperious and oblivious to how close he was to death. If Achilles drew that sword, he'd kill Agamemnon. The Greek alliance would collapse. The war would end in Greek civil war right there on the beach. Athena stopped him. Homer describes her pulling Achilles back by his hair. Only he could see her. She made him a promise, restrain yourself now and you'll receive threefold compensation later. So Achilles didn't draw his sword. But he did something almost as destructive. He withdrew from the war. "Fight your own battles," he told Agamemnon. "I came here as a favour. Troy never wronged me. Hector never raided my kingdom. I fought for 9 years, taken the greatest risks, won the most glory, and received insults in return. I'm done." He retreated to his ships with Patroclus and his Myrmidons. He wouldn't fight, wouldn't attend councils, wouldn't even come out to watch. He sat in his hut, played his lyre, refused all entreaties. Meanwhile, his mother Thetis went to Zeus and called in an old favour. "Make the Greeks lose," she begged. "Make them ask them suffer without my son. Teach Agamemnon what it cost to dishonour Achilles." Zeus agreed. He sent a false dream to Agamemnon, suggesting this was the moment to attack, that victory was assured. Agamemnon believed it, or wanted to believe it, and ordered a full assault. The Greeks formed up, charged across the plain toward Troy's walls, confident that without the need for Achilles' temperamental warrior, they'd finally break through. Troy's gates opened. Hector led the Trojan forces out to meet them, and for the first time in years, the Greeks discovered what it meant to fight without Achilles. The battle raged across the plain. Men we've met, Diomedes, Ajax, Odysseus, fought brilliantly, but something was different. The Trojans, sensing Greek weakness, fought with new confidence. Hector seemed unstoppable, cutting through Greek lines, killing heroes whose names had been famous. The Greeks began to fall back, slowly at first, then more desperately. Paris, fighting from a distance with his bow, shot an arrow that hit Diomedes in the foot. Not a fatal wound, but enough to take the Greeks' best fighter after Achilles out of action. Odysseus found himself surrounded, fought his way clear but was wounded. Ajax held the line through sheer strength, but even he was being pushed back. The Greeks retreated to their wall, that defensive barrier they'd built around their ships. They manned it desperately, throwing spears down at the Trojans who pressed forward with siege ladders and battering rams. For the first time, the Greeks faced the real possibility of total defeat. If the Trojans broke through, they'd burn the ships. Without ships, the Greeks couldn't escape. They'd be stranded, eventually starved or hunted down. This was existential. Agamemnon panicked. He called a council and suggested abandoning the siege, sailing home under cover of darkness. Diomedes, wounded but defiant, shamed him. "You go if you want." Nestor proposed sending an embassy to Achilles, offering him magnificent compensation if he'd return to battle. Bronze tripods, horses, gold, women, even Briseis returned with oaths she'd never been touched. And after Troy fell, he could have his pick of treasures and captives, even marry one of Agamemnon's daughters. Odysseus, Ajax, and old Phoenix went to Achilles' hut as envoys. They found him playing his lyre, singing songs of heroes' glories, his own form of bitter commentary. They delivered the offer. Agamemnon was apologizing, admitting he'd been wrong, offering enormous compensation. Achilles refused. This is the moment that makes the Iliad more than just a war story. Achilles explained his reasoning with devastating clarity. He'd been fighting for honor, for glory, for Kleos. But what good was glory if the system was arbitrary? If Agamemnon could simply take what Achilles had earned? If the commander who stayed safe behind the lines received the same honor as the warrior who risked everything? The entire heroic code was broken, and Achilles wouldn't participate in it anymore. "There are no thanks for fighting," he told them. "The coward and the brave man receive the same honor in death. I've sacked a dozen cities, killed countless enemies, received insulting compensation while Agamemnon grows fat on treasure I won. Why should I die young for his glory? I'm going home." The embassy returned with his refusal. The army despaired. Without Achilles, they couldn't win, but they couldn't retreat either. Not now, not after investing 10 years. They were trapped by their own commitment, by the oath that had brought them here, by the machinery of war that had taken on its own momentum. The battle resumed the next day. Hector and the Trojans pressed harder. They broke through the Greek wall, poured into the camp itself, began fighting among the ships. This was the crisis point. Greek warriors fell back desperately, fighting ship to ship, using the vessels as defensive positions. Hector grabbed a torch, aimed to set the ships ablaze. That's when Patroclus came to Achilles. He'd been watching the battle, seen friends dying, seen the army on the verge of annihilation. "If you won't fight," he begged Achilles, "let me lead the Myrmidons. Give me your armor. The Trojans will see it and think you've returned." Achilles agreed. It seemed safe enough. Patroclus would wear the armor, drive the Trojans back from the ships, but not pursue them to the walls. Stay defensive. Don't take risks. Patroclus armed himself in Achilles' bronze, took his shield and spear, mounted his chariot. The Myrmidons, fresh and eager after sitting out the fighting, formed up behind him. When the Trojans saw Achilles' distinctive armor, they faltered. The greatest warrior had returned. Panic spread through their ranks. Patroclus drove them back across the plain, away from the ships, killing as he went. He was magnificent, not as good as Achilles, but good enough, and backed by the elite Myrmidons. The Greeks rallied. For a few hours, it seemed like the crisis had passed. But Patroclus forgot Achilles' warning. Or maybe he couldn't stop himself. The battle fury took him. He pursued the Trojans back to the walls of Troy itself, began fighting at the gates. He killed Sarpedon, Zeus's grandson. He seemed unstoppable. Then Apollo intervened. The god struck Patroclus, dazed him, knocked the helmet from his head, shattered his spear. In that moment of confusion, Euphorbos, a Trojan warrior, drove his spear into Patroclus's back. As Patroclus stumbled, wounded but still alive, Hector appeared and thrust his spear through Patroclus's belly. Patroclus fell. The battle over his body was ferocious, both sides desperate to either claim or retrieve the corpse. Finally, Menelaus and Ajax fought their way forward, recovered Patroclus's body, carried it back toward the Greek camp while the Trojans pressed after them. A runner reached Achilles with the news. Patroclus was dead. Hector had killed him wearing Achilles' own armor. The sound Achilles made wasn't human. It was primal grief, rage so pure it seemed to warp the air around him. Thetis heard it from the depths of the sea and came to her son. She held him while he wept, knowing what was coming. If Achilles returned to battle to avenge Patroclus, he would die soon after. That was the prophecy: stay out of the war and live long, or fight and die young. "I don't care," Achilles told her. "Life without Patroclus isn't worth living. I failed him. I should have been there. I let my pride, my anger at Agamemnon matter more than protecting the person I loved most. I'm going to kill Hector." Thetis went to Hephaestus and begged him to forge new armor for her son, the finest armor ever made, divine work that would protect him at least briefly. Hephaestus agreed, worked through the night, creating a shield decorated with these images of the entire cosmos, cities at peace and at war, fields being ploughed, vineyards being harvested, the ocean surrounding everything. It was armor that honored the life Achilles was giving up for revenge. At dawn, Achilles armed himself and returned to the war. This was the pinnacle, not of glory but of rage, grief, and doomed determination. Achilles returned to battle not as a hero seeking glory but as a force of vengeance, willing to die as long as he could kill Hector first. The personal tragedy at the war's heart was about to reach its climax. Everything that came before, 9 years of siege, the quarrel with Agamemnon, the refusal to fight, led to this moment. And everything that came after would flow from what Achilles did next. Achilles emerged from his hut at dawn, and even without his new armor yet, something about him made men step back. It wasn't just his reputation or his size, it was the look on his face. Something had broken inside him, and what remained was pure purpose. Kill Hector, kill every Trojan who stood between him and Hector, make them all pay for Patroclus's death. When Hephaestus's divine armor arrived, delivered by Thetis herself, Achilles put it on in silence. The other Greeks watched nervously. This wasn't their Achilles, temperamental, proud, but ultimately one of them. This was something else, something barely human. He didn't speak to Agamemnon or acknowledge the formal end of their quarrel. He just picked up his spear, checked the edge of his sword, and walked toward Troy. The Trojans saw him coming and knew. Whatever advantage they'd gained in his absence evaporated. This was the warrior prophecy said they couldn't defeat, and he was returning in his darkest, most dangerous mood. Hector tried to rally them. He's just a man. He bleeds like we do. But even Hector must have felt cold certainty settling in his stomach. The battle that followed wasn't really a battle. It was a slaughter. Achilles cut through Trojan ranks like a farmer through wheat, not for glory or honour, but from pure rage. Men died begging, men died running, men died fighting bravely. Achilles didn't care, he killed them all with mechanical efficiency. He drove warriors into the Scamander River until it became clogged with bodies, until the river itself, or the god who dwelt within it, rose up in protest. Picture this, the river literally attacking Achilles, trying to drown him with walls of blood-thick water. Only Hephaestus' intervention, sending divine fire to boil the river back, saved him. Even nature itself couldn't stop his rampage. The Trojans broke. Survivors fled toward the city gates. Hector ordered them opened briefly to let his routed army inside, then closed again. But he didn't enter. While everyone else retreated behind walls, Hector stayed outside. He stood alone before Troy's Scaean gate, waiting for Achilles. Why? Honour, partially. He was Troy's champion. He couldn't hide while citizens watched, but also guilt. He'd led the Trojans out. He'd killed Patroclus. He'd pushed too far, grown overconfident in Achilles' absence. Now men were dead because of his decisions, and Hector couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try to face what he'd created. From the walls, Priam and Hecuba begged him to come inside. His parents pleaded, tears streaming, appealing to his love for them. Andromache held their son Astyanax and screamed for Hector to save himself, to save her from widowhood and slavery. The entire city watched, agonized, as their greatest defender stood alone while death approached in the form of Achilles. When Achilles arrived, Hector's nerve broke. He ran, not from cowardice exactly, more from the human-animal response when you see your own death walking toward you in bronze armor, covered in blood, eyes absolutely empty of mercy. Hector ran, and Achilles chased him. 3 times they circled Troy's walls, hunter and prey, while both armies watched. Gods watched too, taking sides, making bets on the outcome. Zeus held up his golden scales, weighing the fates of both men. Hector's side sank. His death was fated for today. Apollo, who'd protected Hector throughout the war, abandoned him. The scales had spoken. Athena intervened with a cruel trick. She disguised herself as Deiphobus, one of Hector's brothers, appeared beside him and said, "Stop running." Hector, believing he had support, stopped running. He turned to face Achilles, thinking his brother had his back. There was no brother. It was just Athena's illusion, and she'd already vanished. Hector stood alone. To his credit, he faced it. He proposed terms. Winner takes the loser's armor, but returns the body for proper burial. This was standard practice, the civilized rule that made warfare bearable. Even enemies honored the dead. Achilles refused. "No oaths between lions and men," he snarled. "No friendship between wolves and lambs." They fought. Hector threw his spear. It struck Achilles' divine shield but didn't penetrate. He called for Deiphobus to hand him another spear, but his brother was gone. He understood then that he'd been tricked, that he was alone, that death was certain. But he drew his sword and charged anyway, because what else could he do? Achilles knew every weakness of the armor Hector wore, because it was Achilles' own armor, stripped from Patroclus' body. He saw the gap at the collarbone where the armor pieces met, drove his spear through Hector's throat. Hector fell, dying, but still able to speak. "I beg you," he managed, blood bubbling from the wound. "Ransom. My father will pay anything. Just return my body." "I wish I could eat your flesh raw," Achilles replied. "There's no ransom that would make me give you back." Then he was gone. What Achilles did next shocked even his own army. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot by the ankles, then dragged it around Troy's walls while the Trojans watched from the battlements, screaming in horror and grief. Andromache fainted. Priam tried to leave the gate to retrieve his son's body and had to be physically restrained. Achilles dragged the body back to the Greek camp and left it in the dirt, unburied, disrespected, the worst fate imaginable in Greek culture. He held funeral games for Patroclus, elaborate ceremonies with athletic contests, prizes, proper honours. Then he cremated Patroclus with full ritual, the smoke carrying his friend's spirit to the afterlife. But Hector's body lay unattended, desecrated, denied the rites that would allow his soul to rest. Every morning for 12 days, Achilles would harness his horses, tie Hector's corpse to his chariot, and drag it around Patroclus's tomb. Every morning, Troy's defenders watched their champion's body being defiled, powerless to stop it. The gods themselves were appalled. Apollo protected the corpse from decay and mutilation, but even divine intervention couldn't end the horror of Achilles' rage. This is where heroism curdles into something darker. Achilles had the right to revenge. Hector killed Patroclus. But this was desecration, violation of every rule that made warfare bearable. This was rage so complete it threatened to tear apart the moral fabric of the world itself. On the 12th night, Priam did something either incredibly brave or incredibly desperate. Guided by Hermes, the old king snuck through the Greek lines to Achilles' hut. He entered alone, knelt before the man who'd killed so many of his sons and begged. "Remember your own father," Priam said. "He's old like me. Think of him waiting for you to come home. I've done what no man should have to do. I've kissed the hands of the man who killed my children. Have mercy, return my son's body." For the first time since Patroclus died, something human flickered behind Achilles' eyes. He looked at this old man, broken by grief, and saw his own father Peleus, who would indeed grieve exactly like this when news of Achilles' death reached home. The rage didn't disappear, but exhaustion replaced it. What was the point? Hector was dead. Patroclus was dead. Soon Achilles himself would be dead. "I'll give you 12 days, Achilles said. Truce for Hector's funeral rites. They shared a meal, killer and victim's father eating bread and wine together in the middle of the night, bound by grief more than anything else. Then Priam took his son's body and returned to Troy. Troy buried Hector with all honours. They built a massive pyre, cremated him with ceremony, collected in his bones, buried them in a golden urn. The entire city mourned their defender, knowing that with Hector gone, Troy's fate was sealed. He'd been their champion, their hope. Without him, what chance did they have? Andromache gave the funeral lament, holding Astyanax, prophesying her own enslaved future and her son's murder, because the Greeks would never let Hector's son grow up to avenge his father. This was the crack that spread. Not Hector's death alone. Heroes died in war all the time, but the violation afterward, the desecration, the way Achilles let rage make him inhuman. And the exhaustion both sides felt. The sense that this war had consumed everything decent and honourable, that it was spinning beyond anyone's control into pure destruction. Troy lost its champion. The Greeks gained nothing except confirmation that even their greatest hero had become something monstrous. Both sides were diminished by Hector's death. The pinnacle had passed. Now there was only the long slide into catastrophe. The 12-day truce ended. The fighting resumed. But something essential had broken. The war would continue, but it had lost whatever glory it might once have claimed. Now it was just slaughter waiting for its conclusion. Achilles knew he was going to die, his mother had told him. Hector had prophesied it with his dying breath. Every morning when he armed himself, he knew this might be the day. And strangely, it didn't seem to bother him. Patroclus was gone. Hector was dead. What was left except to fight until fate caught up with him? But the war kept grinding. Troy's allies, seeing Hector fall, sent reinforcements. They had to. If Troy fell, the Greeks would turn on them next. Better to fight on foreign ground than wait for the invasion of your own lands. Penthesilea arrived first. She was an Amazon, a warrior queen from far to the east, leading a contingent of women fighters. Until Penthesilea started killing them, she was fast, skilled, fearless. For a few days she gave Troy hope. Here was a champion who might match Achilles. They met in combat inevitably. Some sources say Penthesilea shouted challenges specifically at Achilles, seeking the glory of killing the Greeks' greatest warrior. They fought. For a few moments she held in her own, and the watching armies held their breath. Then Achilles drove his spear through her chest. As Penthesilea fell dying, her helmet came off. Achilles saw her face for the first time, young, beautiful, brave, and felt an unexpected pang. Not love exactly, but recognition. She'd been like him, a warrior seeking glory, willing to die young for Kleos. He'd killed his mirror image, but the war moved on. Memnon came next, king of Ethiopia, leading exotic warriors from the edges of the known world. Memnon was formidable, son of Eos, the dawn goddess, almost Achilles' equal in combat. They fought while their divine parents watched, Thetis and Eos both pleading with Zeus to save their sons. Zeus weighed their fates in his golden scales again. Memnon's side sank. Achilles killed him, and Eos wept tears of dew that would fall every morning forever after. Troy was running out of champions. The city that had fielded Hector, Sarpedon, dozens of competent warriors was being bled dry. Paris still lived, but Paris wasn't a frontline fighter. He was an archer, fighting from walls and distance. Useful, but not inspiring. Not the kind of warrior who could stand between Troy and destruction. The Greeks sensed victory approaching. They pressed harder. Raids intensified. The siege tightened. Plans were made to finally breach those impregnable walls. Then Paris killed Achilles. It happened at the Scaean Gate, exactly as Hector had prophesied. Achilles was leading an assault, fighting as recklessly as ever, confident in his near invulnerability. Paris drew his bow, some say Apollo guided the arrow, ensuring it would strike true, and shot. The arrow hit Achilles in the heel, the one place where he was vulnerable. The story of Achilles' heel is almost too perfect, too symbolically neat. When he was an infant, Thetis tried to make him immortal by dipping him in the river Styx. She held him by the heel so that spot never touched the water, remained human, killable. Whether that story is ancient truth or later embellishment doesn't really matter. What matters is that Paris's arrow found the weak spot. Poison on the arrowhead, or divine will, or simple bad luck, and Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, fell. The battle over his body was apocalyptic. Ajax carried Achilles' corpse back toward the ships while Odysseus fought off waves of Trojans trying to claim the greatest prize imaginable. If Troy could capture Achilles' body, deny him burial, that would be psychological victory worth 10 years of fighting. But Ajax was Ajax, unmovable, tireless, and Odysseus was clever and vicious when he needed to be. They got the body back. The Greeks held funeral games for Achilles that lasted days. They cremated him beside Patroclus, mingling their ashes together, raising a great mound that would overlook the Hellespont for centuries. They sacrificed captives and animals. They competed in his honor. And then they faced the terrible question, who gets Achilles' divine armor? Two candidates emerged, Ajax, who'd carried the body, and Odysseus, who'd fought the covering defense. Ajax argued his case based on strength and straightforward valor. Odysseus argued based on intelligence and overall contribution to the war effort. The kings voted. Odysseus won. Ajax went mad. He couldn't accept it. In his mind, he'd done everything right. Been loyal, strong, reliable for 10 years, and received insult in return. Sound familiar? Achilles' story was repeating in Ajax, the same rage at perceived injustice. But where Achilles had Thetis and divine favor, Ajax had only his pride. That night, Ajax planned to murder Odysseus, Agamemnon, and Menelaus, the men he blamed for the decision. He took his sword and went looking for them. But Athena, protecting her favorite Odysseus, drove Ajax temporarily insane. He saw a pen of livestock as the Greek kings and slaughtered animals instead of men. When sanity returned at dawn, Ajax found himself covered in sheep's blood, having made a fool of himself before the entire army. The humiliation was unbearable. He took his sword, the same sword Hector had once given him as a guest gift after they'd fought to a draw back when wars still had honor, and fell on it. Ajax, the rock of the Greek army, committed suicide rather than live with shame. The Greeks cremated another hero. The war had now consumed not just enemies but itself, eating its own greatest warriors through rage, pride, and bitter politics. Troy watched all this from their walls. Achilles dead, Ajax dead, the Greeks tearing themselves apart, and must have felt hope flickering. Maybe they could survive after all. Maybe the prophecies were wrong. But the prophecies weren't wrong, they were just complicated. Yes, Troy would fall, but first the Greeks had to retrieve Philoctetes. Remember him? One of the greatest archers in Greece, in inheritor of Heracles' legendary bow and poisoned arrows. At the war's beginning, Philoctetes had been bitten by a snake on the island of Lemnos. The wound became infected, festering, stinking so badly the other Greeks couldn't stand to be near him. So they abandoned him, left him on Lemnos with his bow and his agony. That had been 9 years ago. Now a captured Trojan prophet revealed that Troy couldn't fall without Heracles' bow. So Odysseus and a few others sailed to Lemnos to retrieve Philoctetes, who'd been surviving alone, eating birds he shot with his divine arrows, nursing his hatred of the men who'd abandoned him. Odysseus begged him to return. Philoctetes refused, understandably. But Heracles himself appeared as a vision, commanded Philoctetes to go to Troy. The wound would be healed there, and he would kill Paris with one of those poisoned arrows. Bound by divine command and the promise of healing, Philoctetes agreed. At Troy, Machaon the physician cleaned the wound properly. 9 years of infection drained away. Philoctetes recovered, armed himself with Heracles' bow, and went hunting for Paris. He found him at the walls, drew the legendary bow, shot an arrow that couldn't miss, hit Paris in the gut, not instantly fatal, but the poison worked quickly. Paris died in agony, perhaps understanding finally that his choice on Mount Ida, his taking of Helen, had destroyed everything he loved. Helen. Her situation was strange by this point. After Paris died, she married Deiphobus, another son of Priam. Whether she wanted to or was forced to depends on which ancient source you believe. Some say she'd regretted leaving Sparta for years, that Aphrodite's spell had worn off, that she longed to go home. Others say she remained loyal to Troy, mourning Paris genuinely, accepting Deiphobus out of necessity. The truth, as always with Helen, is obscured by the male writers telling her story. But Troy's fate was sealed now. Achilles had his dead, but his work done. Paris dead. Hector dead. The major champions were gone. The prophecies were aligning. The Greeks had the bow of Heracles. They'd retrieved Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, from his home island, bringing him to Troy as prophecy demanded. They'd stolen the Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena, from Troy's temple through Odysseus and Diomedes' night raid. Another prophesied requirement for victory. All the pieces were in place. Troy just didn't know it yet. The unravelling had happened slowly, hero by hero, prophecy by prophecy. The war that had seemed eternal was approaching its end. Not the grand climactic battle anyone had imagined, but a sneaking, underhanded trick that Odysseus was already planning in his clever, restless mind. A trick involving a wooden horse. 10 years. 10 years of fighting, dying, burying the dead, watching the seasons cycle through their endless pattern. Both sides were exhausted. Troy's population had declined from death, disease, and despair. The countryside around the city was a desert, every tree cut down, every field trampled. The Greeks had lost thousands, including their greatest heroes. Supply lines stretched thin. Men wanted to go home, but neither side could stop. The Greeks couldn't return after 10 years with nothing to show. Troy couldn't surrender after enduring a decade of siege. They were locked in mutual destruction, trapped by pride and sunk costs. That's when Odysseus proposed the horse. The plan was audacious, desperate, and absolutely dependent on Trojan psychology. Build a massive wooden horse, hide Greek warriors inside, leave it on the beach as an apparent offering to Athena, abandoned by a Greek army that had supposedly given up and sailed home. The Trojans, believing they'd won, would drag the horse inside their walls as a trophy. At night, the hidden Greeks would emerge, open the gates, then let in the rest of the army, which wouldn't have actually left but would be hiding on the nearby island of Tenedos. It was such an obvious trick. Who would fall for it? But Odysseus understood something about human nature. People believe what they want to believe. Troy desperately wanted the war to be over, wanted to believe they'd outlasted the Greeks, wanted vindication after 10 years of suffering. That desperation would make them careless. The Greeks built the horse under Epeius' direction. It was massive, tall enough to hold perhaps 30 warriors, maybe more depending on which ancient source you trust. They carved it from wood, made it beautiful, dedicated it to Athena with inscriptions. The best warriors volunteered for the suicide mission. Odysseus himself, Menelaus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, and others. If the plan failed, if they were discovered, they'd die horribly. The Greeks burned their camp. Everything that had become familiar over 10 years, the huts, the walls, the defensive ditches, went up in flames. The army loaded onto ships and sailed away, disappearing over the horizon towards Tenedos. Only the wooden horse remained on the beach, massive and strange and seemingly abandoned. Troy's scouts reported the news. The Greeks were gone. Actually gone. The beach was empty except for smouldering ruins and one huge wooden horse. Trojan sentries watched through the day to be sure. No movement, no ambush. The siege was over. Troy exploded in celebration. The gates opened fully for the first time in 10 years. People poured out onto the plain, dancing, crying, unable to believe their ordeal was finished. They walked through the abandoned Greek camp, marveling at the destruction, claiming small souvenirs, and that they gathered around the wooden horse, arguing about what to do with it. Some Trojans urged caution. He threw a spear at the horse's flank. If he had thrown harder, or if fate had wanted him to succeed, he might have heard the men inside reacting, might have pierced the wood deeply enough to strike someone. But the spear stuck harmlessly. Then the Greeks' plan received unexpected help. The soldiers hiding on Tendos had left behind one man, Sinon, a Greek who'd volunteered for an incredibly dangerous role. He'd let himself be captured by Trojan scouts, played the role of traumatized deserter. He claimed the Greeks had tried to sacrifice him to ensure safe passage home. Odysseus had accused him falsely to cover some personal grudge. So he'd escaped, was left behind, begged Troy for mercy. Sinon's story was elaborate and convincing because it was emotionally true even if factually false. He was terrified, genuinely, because if he failed, he'd die. He wept while telling his lies, and he provided the key information. The horse was an offering to Athena, built too large deliberately so Troy couldn't bring it inside the walls. If they destroyed it, Athena would curse them, but if they brought it inside Troy, they'd receive Athena's blessing and be forever protected. It was perfect reverse psychology. Tell Troy they can't have the horse and they'd absolutely want it. Priam called a council. Some argued for destroying it immediately. Cassandra screamed prophecies about destruction and fire, but as always, her curse meant nobody believed her. Others argued for leaving it where it was, but the majority wanted it brought inside. It was a trophy. It was Athena's blessing. It was proof they'd defeated the Greeks. And maybe, after 10 years of being trapped inside walls, they couldn't resist the symbolic victory of capturing something Greek and making it Trojan. They decided to bring it in. The horse was too large for the gates, so they broke down part of the wall, think about that, breaking their own defences to admit the thing, and dragged the horse through Troy's streets to the citadel. They celebrated all night. Wine flowed, music played. For the first time in a decade, Troy let its guard down completely. Inside the horse, the Greek warriors waited in darkness, cramped and terrified, listening to celebration happening all around them. Odysseus kept them silent through sheer force of will. One sound, one cough, one person panicking, and it was over. Laocoon made one last attempt to warn Troy. He was preparing a sacrifice to Poseidon when two massive sea serpents emerged from the water, slithered across the beach and strangled him and his two sons in front of the horrified crowd. The Trojans interpreted this as divine punishment. Laocoon had questioned the horse, so the gods killed him. It was actually Athena's doing, but the Trojans didn't know that. They saw divine confirmation of their decision. As night deepened and Troy finally fell asleep, exhausted by celebration, Sinon crept to the horse and gave the signal. Odysseus opened the trapdoor. One by one, the Greek warriors climbed out, stiff and cramped but alive. They moved through the sleeping city to the gates and opened them from inside. The Greek army, which had rowed back from Tenedos in darkness, poured in. Troy woke to slaughter. The Greeks, who'd spent 10 years frustrated by those walls, were in no mood for mercy. They swept through the city, killing everything. Men were cut down in their homes. Women and children were dragged into the streets. Priam, the old king, tried to fight despite his age and was killed at the altar where he'd sought sanctuary. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, murdered him, showing he'd inherited his father's capacity for brutal violence. Hector's son, Astyanax, just a child, was thrown from Troy's walls. The Greeks couldn't risk any of Hector's line surviving to seek revenge later. Andromache's worst fears came true. Her husband dead, her son murdered, herself about to be enslaved. She was claimed by Neoptolemus, forced to become the concubine of the man who'd helped kill her family. Deiphobus, Helen's second husband, was butchered. Some say Helen herself helped Menelaus find him, either from lingering loyalty to her first husband or from desperate self-preservation. Menelaus found Helen and raised his sword to kill her. But when he saw her face, that face that had launched 1,000 ships, his anger melted. Or maybe Aphrodite intervened, making him remember his love. Either way, he didn't kill her, he took her back. The Greeks looted everything valuable, they burned buildings methodically, fire spreading from structure to structure until smoke obscured the stars. They desecrated temples, which would bring its own curse later. Ajax the Lesser raped Cassandra in Athena's temple while she clung to the goddess's statue, an act so sacrilegious that even the other Greeks were horrified. Athena would make them all pay for that violation during their journeys home. By dawn, Troy was gone, not just defeated, erased. The walls that had stood for generations were broken. The palace where Priam had ruled lay in ruins. The temples were desecrated. The population was dead or enslaved. Everything that had made Troy Troy, its culture, its identity, its people, was destroyed in a single night of systematic violence. The Greeks gathered their spoils. Women were divided among the victors like any other treasure. Andromache to Neoptolemus, Cassandra to Agamemnon, other captives distributed according to rank and contribution. Wealth beyond imagining, 10 years of accumulated Trojan treasure, was loaded onto ships. They'd come for Helen and honor. They were leaving with genocide and gold. Some Greeks felt uneasy. This didn't feel like victory. It felt like something darker. They'd won through deception, violated divine sanctuaries, slaughtered civilians. The war had been brutal throughout, but this final night crossed lines that even Bronze Age warriors recognized. Omens appeared, strange flights of birds, unnatural weather, priests and seers warning of divine displeasure. But most Greeks just wanted to go home. 10 years away from wives, children, kingdoms, 10 years of violence and deprivation. Troy was destroyed. The oath to defend Menelaus's marriage was fulfilled. They had wealth to show for their sacrifice, time to sail. They didn't know yet that the journey home would be almost as deadly as the war itself, that the gods were angry, that storms would scatter the fleet, drowning men who'd survived a decade of combat, that curses would follow them back to Greece where wives had grown resentful, where power structures had shifted, where returning kings would find plots and betrayal waiting. Agamemnon didn't know that Clytemnestra was waiting in Mycenae with a blade and a decade of hatred for sacrificing Iphigenia. Odysseus didn't know his journey home would take another 10 years, filled with monsters and divine punishment. Ajax the Lesser didn't know he'd die when his ship was wrecked on the rocks. Menelaus didn't know he and Helen would wander the Mediterranean for years before reaching Sparta, but that's all later. For now, Troy burned. The breaking point had come and passed. The city that had withstood 10 years of siege fell in a single night because they'd let their guard down, believed what they wanted to believe, allowed a wooden horse through their broken wall. It's almost allegorical in its perfection. The thing you invite in, thinking it's a prize, turns out to be your destruction. The Trojan War was ending not with glory but with ashes. The heroes who'd fought with such magnificent courage, Hector, Achilles, Ajax, Sarpedon, were dead. The civilians who'd endured the siege with stubborn pride were dead or enslaved. The city that had been the jewel of the Troad was smoking rubble. Both sides had lost. The Greeks had their victory, but at such cost that it would destroy most of them. Troy was gone entirely. Nobody won the Trojan War. It consumed everyone it touched and left only ghosts and stories. The survivors loaded their ships and sailed away from the burning city, leaving behind mass graves and ruins. Troy would become a cautionary tale, a name that meant loss and pride and the terrible price of war. But none of them knew that yet. For now, they just sailed. And behind them, Troy burned through the night, collapsing into itself, becoming memory. The morning after Troy fell, as smoke still rose from the ruins, the Greeks prepared to depart. They'd won. They had their spoils. Now they wanted to go home. But the sea, which had brought them here 10 years ago, wouldn't let them leave easily. The fleet gathered in the harbour. Over 1,000 ships, though fewer than had arrived. Many had been lost to storms, combat and time. The captive women were loaded aboard, sitting among the cargo like any other prize. The treasure was secured. Sacrifices were made to the gods for safe passage. Everything seemed ready. Then the storms came. Not natural storms, divine punishment. Athena was furious about Ajax the Lesser's violation of her temple. Poseidon, who'd helped build Troy's walls in ancient times, was angry at its destruction. Other gods had their own grievances. so they sent tempests that scattered the Greek fleet across the Mediterranean like leaves in a gale. Ships were driven onto rocks. Men who'd survived a decade of combat drowned within sight of home. Ajax the Lesser's vessel was wrecked on the Gerenian rocks. He managed to swim to a boulder, boasted that he'd survived despite the god's wrath. Poseidon heard the boast, struck the rock with his trident, split it, and Ajax drowned in the surge. Hubris met Nemesis even in victory. The fleet was scattered. Each contingent had to find its own way home, and each found different disasters waiting. Agamemnon made it back to Mycenae relatively quickly. He brought Cassandra with him as his concubine, the prophet who'd warned Troy and been ignored now warning Agamemnon. She prophesied his death. He ignored her, just like Troy had. When he entered his palace, he found a feast prepared by Clytemnestra. She welcomed him warmly, suggested he bathe to wash off the journey's dust. He agreed, unsuspecting. While Agamemnon bathed, Clytemnestra trapped him in a net, a garment with no opening designed to tangle and immobilize. Aegisthus, Clytemnestra's lover, struck the first blow, then Clytemnestra herself took the axe and finished it. She murdered the king of Mycenae in his own bath, revenge for Iphigenia's sacrifice 10 years earlier. Some sources say she killed Cassandra too, unable to bear her husband's concubine living. The commander-in-chief of the Greek forces, the man who'd held the alliance together for a decade, died within hours of returning home, killed by his own wife. His son Orestes was away, too young to prevent it. Years later, Orestes would return and kill Clytemnestra to avenge his father, perpetuating the cycle of blood vengeance that plagued the house of Atreus. Menelaus and Helen had their own difficult journey. Storms drove them to Egypt, then Crete, then across the Mediterranean. They wandered for years, accumulating more treasure through trade and raids, but unable to find their way home. When they finally reached Sparta, they resumed their marriage as if the decade apart had been a strange dream. Helen grew old in Sparta, beautiful, still, but haunted, never quite able to explain even to herself what had happened in Troy. Odysseus's journey became its own epic. He was blown off course immediately, spent 10 years wandering from the Cyclops' cave to Circe's island, from the underworld to the Sirens, from Scylla and Charybdis to Calypso's island. He lost all his men, all his ships, everything. He returned to Ithaca alone after 20 years' total absence, found his house full of suitors trying to marry Penelope, had to fight one last battle in his own home. But at least he made it home, many didn't. Diomedes returned to find his wife had taken a lover, was forced into exile, eventually founded cities in Italy. Idomeneus of Crete made it home but was accused of sacrilege and exiled. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, claimed Andromache as his prize, but was later killed at Delphi, murdered over a dispute about sacrificial meat, a stupid, meaningless death for the son of the greatest warrior. Some survivors adapted better than others. Nestor, old when the war started and ancient now, made it home to Pylos without incident. Perhaps his age earned divine respect, or perhaps he'd been wise enough to avoid the worst sacrileges. He lived out his days telling stories about the war, becoming the voice of memory, the living link to Troy. But what about the Trojans? The survivors on the losing side? Most Trojan women were enslaved. Andromache bore Neoptolemus' children in captivity, living with the man whose father killed her husband and whose hand threw her son from the walls. Later, after Neoptolemus died, she married Helenus, another son of Priam, one of the few male survivors. They founded a small settlement in Epirus, creating a tiny echo of Troy in foreign land. Cassandra died in Mycenae, murdered alongside or by Clytemnestra, her final prophecies unheeded to the end. Hecuba, Troy's queen and Priam's widow, was enslaved by the Greeks. Different traditions give her different fates. Some say she was transformed into a dog, either literally or metaphorically, driven mad by grief. Others say she was stoned to death after killing Greek soldiers in revenge. None of her endings are peaceful, but one Trojan escaped the destruction and carried Troy's legacy forward. Aeneas. Aeneas was a cousin of the royal family, son of Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite. He'd fought throughout the war, survived when so many hadn't. On the night Troy fell, he initially fought the invading Greeks, until realizing the battle was hopeless. Then, and this is where the traditions diverge, he either negotiated safe passage with the Greeks in exchange for revealing secret passages, betrayal that saved his life, or the gods commanded him to flee and preserve Troy's future. Aeneas gathered survivors, his elderly father Anchises, his young son Ascanius, loyal warriors who'd escaped the slaughter, women and children who needed protection. He carried his father on his back out of the burning city, a famous image representing duty and piety. They made it to the ships and escaped. Aeneas's journey became another epic. He wandered the Mediterranean like Odysseus, but where Odysseus sought home, Aeneas sought a new homeland. His group settled temporarily in various places: Thrace, Crete, Carthage. In Carthage he loved Dido the queen and almost stayed, but the gods commanded him to continue. Dido killed herself when he left, cursing Rome for generations, because Rome was Aeneas's destination. He landed in Italy, fought wars against the native peoples, married a Latin princess, and founded the lineage that would eventually produce Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. Through Aeneas, Troy's legacy survived and transformed. The losers of one story became the ancestors of the greatest empire the ancient world would know. This became Rome's founding myth. They weren't barbarians, but descendants of sophisticated Troy. They had inherited Eastern refinement and Western strength. When Rome later conquered Greece, it was framed as Troy's revenge, the descendants of Aeneas defeating the descendants of Agamemnon. Other Trojan survivors scattered across the Mediterranean. Some traditions say they founded cities in Sicily, North Africa, even Britain. Whether these stories are true matters less than what they represent. The refusal to let Troy die completely. The losers wouldn't accept erasure. They preserved their identity by claiming Trojan ancestry, by insisting that something survived the fire. The scattered survivors carried trauma, memory, and determination. They'd lost everything: home, family, identity, but they hadn't lost themselves. The women enslaved in Greek households taught their children about Troy. The men who escaped to found new cities built temples to Trojan gods. The stories were told and retold, each generation adding layers, preserving the memory. What remained of Troy wasn't the physical city, that was ash and broken stone. What remained was the story, the memory of glory and catastrophe, the warning about pride and the price of war, the tragic beauty of doomed heroism, the knowledge that even total victory is hollow when it costs everything you valued. The Greeks returned home to find their kingdoms changed, their families estranged, their certainties shattered. The Trojans scattered to strange lands where they had to build new identities from fragments. Neither side won in any meaningful sense. Both were transformed, diminished, haunted by what they'd done and what had been done to them. But the story survived. That's what remained when the smoke cleared and the seas calmed and the years passed. The story of 10 years that destroyed a city and corrupted an army, that tested every value Bronze Age culture held sacred and found most of them wanting. The survivors carried that story to every corner of the Mediterranean world, and it took root, grew, became foundational to Western culture itself. Troy fell, but in falling it became immortal. Centuries passed. Troy's ruins weathered under Mediterranean sun and winter rains. Stones that had witnessed Hector and Achilles crumbled into dust. The people who'd actually experienced the war died, then their children, then their children's children. Direct memory faded, but the story didn't fade, it grew. By the time Homer composed the Iliad and Odyssey, probably in the 8th century BCE, some 400 years after any actual conflict, Troy had become legendary. Homer wasn't writing history in our sense. He was creating epic poetry from oral traditions passed down through generations of singers, each adding embellishments, each shaping the tale for their audience. Homer chose to tell only a small slice. The Iliad covers just a few weeks in the 10th year, focusing on Achilles' rage and its consequences. The fall of Troy itself, the wooden horse, the city's destruction, isn't in the Iliad at all. It's referenced, prophesied, but not depicted. Homer was more interested in the psychology of warriors, the relationship between humans and gods, the tragedy of choices that doom you regardless. The Odyssey told what happened after, following Odysseus' decade-long journey home. Together, these epics became the foundation of Greek culture. Every educated Greek memorized significant portions. Schoolboys learned to read using Homer. Generals consulted Homer before battle, looking for strategic insights or moral lessons. Homer became scripture, philosophy, entertainment, and history all combined. Other poets filled in the gaps. The epic cycle, mostly lost now, surviving only in fragments and summaries, told the parts Homer skipped. The Cypria covered the war's origins, the judgment of Paris, the gathering at Aulis. The Aethiopis told of Penthesilea and Memnon. The Little Iliad and Iliu Persis described the wooden horse and Troy's fall. The Nostoi covered the Greeks' disastrous homecomings. These poems are mostly gone, but ancient audiences knew them, creating a complete narrative from beginning to end. Greek tragedy seized on Trojan themes. Aeschylus wrote Agamemnon, dramatizing Clytemnestra's revenge. Sophocles gave us Ajax, exploring the great warrior's suicide and questions of honor. Euripides wrote multiple Troy plays. Hecuba, about Troy's enslaved queen. Trojan Women, about the captive women's suffering. Andromache, about Hector's widow's fate. Iphigenia in Aulis, about the sacrifice that started it all. What's striking about Greek tragedy's treatment of Troy is how it often took the Trojan side. Euripides especially showed Trojan suffering with heartbreaking sympathy. Hecuba mourning her murdered grandchildren. Andromache pleading for her son's life. These weren't monsters, they were humans destroyed by forces beyond their control. The Greeks in these plays often appear as brutal conquerors, their victory hollow and cruel. Why did Greeks keep telling stories that made them look bad? Perhaps because the Trojan War became a way to explore moral complexity. Victory and justice aren't the same thing. You can win and still be wrong. Power doesn't equal virtue. These were sophisticated ideas, examined through the safe distance of legendary past. The Romans, when they became the Mediterranean's dominant power, claimed Trojan descent through Aeneas. Virgil's Aeneid, written in the 1st century BCE, retold Aeneas's escape and journey to Italy with gorgeous poetry and political purpose. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, traced his Julian family line back to Ascanius, Aeneas's son. So Troy wasn't just a defeated enemy, it was Rome's glorious ancestor. This created interesting dynamics when Rome conquered Greece. Were they avenging Troy, conquering their own cultural ancestors? The Greeks, meanwhile, had to reconcile being conquered by people they'd considered barbarians, but who now claimed descent from civilized Troy. The whole thing was tangled, ironic, perfect for intellectual exercise. Byzantine scholars preserved the Trojan texts. Medieval Europeans, working from Latin translations, obsessed over Troy. The story was retold in French, German, English. Medieval romances added chivalric elements foreign to the original but popular with contemporary audiences. The Romance of Troy became one of the most copied texts of the Middle Ages. Shakespeare knew Troy. Troilus and Cressida is his cynical take on the war, stripping away heroic veneer to show petty, flawed people making terrible choices. It's bitter and brilliant, Shakespeare using ancient Troy to comment on contemporary politics and human nature. Artists painted Troy endlessly. The Renaissance loved classical subjects. The Judgment of Paris, Hector's farewell to Andromache. Here, Achilles mourning Patroclus, Aeneas fleeing burning Troy. Each era painted Troy in their own style, their own values, finding new meanings in old stories. The 19th century brought something different: archaeology. Heinrich Schliemann, a German businessman obsessed with Homer, decided to prove Troy was real. In 1870, he began excavating at Hisarlik in Turkey, where tradition placed Troy. He found it, or rather, he found multiple cities layered on top of each other, civilizations built, destroyed, and rebuilt over thousands of years. Schliemann's methods were crude by modern standards. He damaged the site trying to reach what he believed was Homer's Troy. But he proved that Troy existed as a physical place, not just poetry. Later archaeologists refined his work, identified Troy VII as the likely candidate for the legendary city, dated its destruction to around 1180 BCE, right when Bronze Age civilization was collapsing across the eastern Mediterranean. The archaeological evidence doesn't prove Homer's specific stories. It can't tell us if Helen was real or if Achilles killed Hector. But it confirms a major fortified city existed where the poems placed it, that it was destroyed violently around the right time, that it controlled important trade routes worth fighting over. The poetry and archaeology don't contradict each other, even if they don't perfectly align. Modern scholars debate endlessly. Was there a historical kernel to the legend? Did Mycenaean Greeks really besiege a city in Anatolia for years? Or is the Trojan War a myth that incorporated memories of multiple conflicts, Bronze Age collapse, cultural trauma? maybe it doesn't matter. The story is real in its impact, regardless of historical accuracy. The Trojan War gave Western culture its template for understanding conflict. The Iliad is the first and arguably still the greatest war literature. It doesn't glorify war, it shows war as wasteful, tragic, destructive of everything valuable. But it also shows humans capable of remarkable courage, sacrifice and loyalty under the worst conditions. That complexity, war is terrible and humans in war can be magnificent, defined how Western culture would think about combat. Every subsequent war was compared to Troy. Alexander the Great visited Achilles' tomb before beginning his conquests. Roman soldiers quoted Homer. Medieval knights imagined themselves as Hector or Achilles. Modern soldiers in both world wars carried Homer into trenches, finding in Bronze Age warriors something that spoke to their own experience. The language Troy gave us persists. Achilles' heel, Trojan horse, Helen's face launching ships, Ajax defying the lightning. These phrases carry meaning beyond their origins, coming shorthand for vulnerability, deception, deadly beauty, defiant courage. Troy became the lens through which Western culture examined war's paradoxes: glory and horror, victory and loss, heroism and waste, the way conflict destroys even its winners. The Trojan War isn't history in a conventional sense. It's something more potent. A story so resonant, so archetypal that it becomes truth regardless of facts. The afterlife and legacy of Troy is everywhere. It's in every war story that questions whether the victory was worth the cost. It's in every examination of male honor and its price. It's in every reflection on what survives catastrophe. It's in the recognition that sometimes the loser's story matters more than the winner's. Troy fell 3,000 years ago, give or take, but it's never stopped burning in human imagination. The story keeps being retold because it keeps being relevant. We still wage wars over honor and resources. We still debate whether great ends justify terrible means. We still wonder what happens to the women and children in conquered cities. We still ask what survives when everything burns. Troy gave us a way to think about these questions by placing them in heroic distance, where we could examine them without the pain of immediacy, but with all the force of emotional truth. That's why the story endured, was transformed, was adopted by culture after culture, each finding in fallen Troy something essential about human experience. The legacy isn't the ruins at Hisarlik, though those matter. It's not even Homer's poetry specifically, though that's precious beyond measure. The legacy is the idea of Troy, the city that stood 10 years, fell to trickery, left survivors scattered but unbroken, gave us stories that outlasted its stones. For centuries, Troy was myth. Educated Europeans knew Homer intimately, debated his meanings, but didn't expect physical Troy to exist. The poems were literature, allegory, perhaps corrupted memories of some minor conflict, but not archaeology. Then came Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann is a complicated figure, part visionary, part vandal. Born in 1822 in Germany to a poor family, he became obsessed with Homer as a child. His father read him stories of Troy, and young Schliemann decided he'd prove it all really happened. He made a fortune in business first, indigo trade, gold rush banking, then retired in his 40s to pursue archaeology with more enthusiasm than training. In 1868, Schliemann visited the Troad, the region around the Dardanelles where Homer placed Troy. Local tradition and some earlier scholars suggested a hill called Hisarlik might be the site. Schliemann began excavating in 1870 with methods that would horrify modern archaeologists. He dug massive trenches straight through the mound, destroying later layers to reach what he thought was Homer's Troy at the bottom. What he found astonished everyone. Multiple cities layered like geological strata, each built on the ruins of the previous one. 9 major levels, each representing different periods of habitation spanning from 3000 BCE to Roman times. Troy had been destroyed and rebuilt repeatedly, its strategic position making it valuable across millennia. Schliemann initially identified Troy II, a magnificent city from around 2500 BCE, as Homer's Troy. He found spectacular gold jewelry, the treasure of Priam he called it, smuggling it out of Turkey, eventually donating it to Germany, where it was stolen by the Soviets in 1945 and ended up in Moscow, causing international disputes that continue. But Troy was far too early. It existed 1,000 years before the Late Bronze Age, when the legendary war supposedly occurred. Later archaeologists, especially Wilhelm Dörpfeld and Carl Blegen, refined the chronology. They identified Troy the 70, a city destroyed by violence around 1180 BCE, as the likely candidate for Homeric Troy. This city had massive walls, controlled regional trade, showed signs of siege and conflagration. The dating aligned with the Bronze Age collapse, when mysterious catastrophes destroyed civilizations throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The archaeological Troy is both more and less than legend suggested. The walls are impressive, but not as massive as Homer described. Reality needed poetic embellishment. The city was significant regionally, but not the metropolis of myth. There's evidence of conflict, destruction by fire, but no proof of specific heroes or 10-year siege. What archaeology does confirm is that a major fortified city existed where Homer said it did, that it was destroyed violently at roughly the right time, that it sat at a strategic location worth fighting over. The geography Homer describes, the plain, the rivers, the relationship to the Hellespont, matches reality with uncanny accuracy. Someone who knew this landscape intimately composed those poems. Excavations continue at Hisarlik. Modern archaeologists use ground-penetrating radar, careful stratigraphy, techniques that preserve rather than destroy. They've found that Troy was larger than initially thought, with an extensive lower town beyond the citadel. The population might have been several thousand, substantial for Bronze Age Anatolia. They've found Mycenaean Greek pottery at Troy, evidence of trade or presence. They've found evidence of earthquake damage and rebuilding. They've found layers of ash from massive fires. They've found horse bones, interesting given the wooden horse story, though this connection is speculative. What they haven't found is proof of Homer's specific narrative. No evidence for 1,000-ship invasions or 10-year sieges. Archaeology deals in physical remains, and most of what makes the Trojan War story powerful, the personalities, the motivations, the dramatic moments, doesn't survive as artifacts. This creates productive tension between archaeology and literature. Are they describing the same event? Or did Homer take vague memories of Bronze Age conflicts and create compelling fiction? The scholarly consensus is messy. There was probably some conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and Troy, but Homer's account is heavily mythologized, composed centuries later from oral traditions that mixed with multiple events, added divine machinery, crafted narrative arcs. Modern interpretation of Troy has been influenced by changing methodologies and politics. 19th century scholars often read Homer looking for accurate historical reportage, assuming his descriptions of combat, social structures, and geography reflected reality. 20th century scholars became more skeptical, emphasizing how much is clearly mythological, warning against naive reading of epic poetry as history. Meanwhile, different academic disciplines claimed Troy for different purposes. Classicists analyzed the poetry, archaeologists excavated the site, historians debated Bronze Age politics, anthropologists examined social structures. Each found different insights, sometimes contradictory. The discovery of linear B tablets, Mycenaean Greek written records from the Bronze Age, revealed that Homeric society wasn't purely fictional. The administrative systems, social hierarchies, religious practices Homer described had basis in Mycenaean reality. But the tablets are bureaucratic inventories, not narratives. They list sheep and grain, not heroes and battles. Hittite archives from Anatolia mention conflicts in western Anatolia, a place called Wilusa that might be Ilion Troy, conflicts with Ahiawa that might be Achaeans Greeks. These tantalizing references suggest political tensions in the right region at the right time, but they're fragmentary, ambiguous, don't describe anything like Homer's war. Modern Troy interpretation also reflects contemporary concerns. Feminist scholars have recovered women's perspectives, Helen, Andromache, Hecuba, Cassandra, Briseis, examining how war affects non-combatants, how women survive and resist. Post-colonial scholars note the power dynamics, the way Greek narrative erased Trojan voices, the way empire always tells history from victors' perspectives. Anti-war readings emphasize how Homer actually critiques war despite epic's martial genre. The Iliad shows war destroying everything valuable. Achilles loses Patroclus, Hector loses his life, families are shattered, cities burn. Priam and Achilles weeping together over their mutual losses becomes more significant than any battle victory. Modern readers living through 20th century total war found in Homer a Bronze Age poet who understood war's essential tragedy. What's remarkable is how the story keeps generating new interpretations. Each generation finds new questions to ask of Troy, new meanings to extract. The archaeological site keeps yielding new discoveries. In 2003, researchers announced finding evidence of a previously unknown destruction layer, potentially complicating the chronology further. Troy exists in multiple forms now: the archaeological site in Turkey, a tourist destination with reconstructed gates and inevitable wooden horse replica, the literary Troy of Homer's poetry studied in every classics program, the legendary Troy of popular imagination, source of movies and novels and endless retellings, the scholarly Troy of academic debate about myth, history and memory. All these Troys coexist, sometimes contradicting, sometimes enriching each other. The archaeological yield of Troy proves there was something real beneath the poetry. The literary Troy preserves truths about human nature that mere facts can't capture. The legendary Troy shows mythology's power to shape culture across millennia. The scholarly Troy demonstrates how we never stop questioning, revising, debating our understanding of the past. The rediscovery of physical Troy didn't diminish the story. It complicated it in fascinating ways. We can now stand where heroes supposedly fought, look out over the plain toward the Hellespont, imagine ships beaching on shores we can visit. That immediacy makes the legend more vivid, while simultaneously emphasizing how much we don't and can't know. The modern interpretation of Troy acknowledges uncertainty while preserving wonder. We may never know if Achilles was real, if Helen existed, if there was actually a 10-year siege, but we know humans in the Bronze Age Mediterranean fought wars over trade routes and honor, that those conflicts were remembered in oral traditions that eventually became Homer's poetry, that the stories resonated so powerfully they've survived 3,000 years of cultural change. That's what we found when we rediscovered Troy, not proof of myth's literal truth, but evidence of something perhaps more important: the way humans use stories to make sense of violence, loss, and survival. The way poetry preserves truths that archaeology can only hint at. The way falling cities leave ruins we can excavate and legends that never die. Here's what strikes me about the Trojan War after spending all this time with the story. It's not really about Troy, it never was. The war itself, the siege, the battles, the eventual destruction, is almost beside the point. What the story is actually about is everything that surrounds warfare. The choices that lead to it, the transformation it causes in people, the way it corrupts even the victorious, the question of what survives catastrophe. Let's start with the causes. Paris' choice, Menelaus' honor, Agamemnon's ambition. Think about how small the actual trigger was. An apple at a wedding feast, a beauty contest, a young man choosing desire over wisdom. These are the kinds of decisions people make every day, usually without burning cities as consequences. But the Trojan War teaches us about cascading effects, about how personal choices intersect with larger forces. Paris' abduction of Helen doesn't happen in isolation. It occurs in a world where kingdoms are already looking for excuses to fight, where trade routes need controlling, where ambitious kings want glory. Helen becomes the justification for a war that had multiple causes, most of them economic and for political. We do this still. Wars are fought for resources, power, and strategic advantage, but we frame them as being about honor, freedom, justice, abstract values that make violence seem noble. The Trojan War is the template for that pattern. The heroic code itself comes under devastating examination in the story. Achilles embodies that code taken to extremes. He's the perfect warrior, the one who will sacrifice everything for glory and honor. But Homer shows us the cost. Achilles loses Patroclus, the person he actually loves, because he's too proud to fight when needed. Then he becomes a monster in his grief, desecrating Hector's body, losing his humanity to rage. What does glory mean if it requires you to destroy what you love? If honor demands you become something terrible? These aren't abstract questions. They are the fundamental paradox of warrior culture, any culture that values martial prowess and aggressive honor above other virtues. Troy asks, what if the heroes are wrong? What if courage and honor, divorced from wisdom and compassion, are actually destructive? Hector is the counterexample. He fights not for glory but from duty, to protect his city, his family, his people. He knows the prophecies, knows Troy will fall, knows he'll probably die, and fights anyway, because what else can he do? That's a different kind of heroism, not glorious but necessary, not chosen but accepted. Modern audiences often find Hector more sympathetic than Achilles. We've lived through enough wars to be suspicious of glory-seeking. We value the defender over the aggressor, the person fighting for home rather than conquest. But ancient audiences would have seen it differently. Achilles was the ideal, Hector the tragic figure doomed by fighting for the losing side. That shift tells us something about how values change while the story endures. Troy's meaning isn't fixed. Each era finds different emphasis, different heroes, different lessons. The women's stories in Troy reveal power dynamics that ancient audiences accepted but modern readers question. Helen, blamed for causing the war though she had little agency in it. Andromache, the perfect wife who loses everything. Cassandra, speaking truth that no one believes. Briseis, caught between men's honour disputes. Hecuba, transformed from queen to slave. These women survive catastrophes that destroy the men. The male heroes die gloriously or ignominiously, but they die. The women are enslaved, raped, dispersed, but they endure. Some modern readings see in this a critique of male honour culture. The women pay the price for male pride, survive the wars men create, carry forward whatever fragments can be salvaged. The question of what survives is crucial. Troy was utterly destroyed, but Trojan refugees carried their culture forward. Aeneas founding Rome is mythological, but the principle is real. Conquerors can erase cities, but not necessarily identity. Stories preserve what stones can't. This has implications for every culture that's experienced conquest or catastrophe. You don't need the physical place to maintain identity. You need stories, language, traditions, the determination to not be erased. Troy teaches that defeat isn't the end if survivors refuse to let it be. The relationship between myth and reality in Troy tells us something about how humans process trauma. The Bronze Age collapse that destroyed Troy also destroyed most other major civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean. The reasons aren't entirely clear, possibly climate change, sea raids, systems collapse, multiple factors creating cascade failure. People living through that catastrophe didn't have frameworks to understand systemic collapse, so they told stories about heroes and gods, about specific choices and actions, imposing narrative meaning on chaotic destruction. The Trojan War became a way to explain incomprehensible loss. At least if Troy fell because of Helen and Paris and Achilles, there were causes, reasons, meanings. We do the same thing. We turn wars and disasters into stories with heroes and villains, with clear causes and moral lessons, even when reality is messier and more complex. Troy is the original example of mythology as historical processing, of narrative as a way to make sense of senselessness. The gods in the Trojan War are fascinating for what they reveal about human powerlessness. Mortals make choices, but divine will constantly intervenes, redirects, dooms. Achilles can't save Patroclus because Apollo intervenes. Hector can't escape Achilles because Athena tricks him. Paris kills Achilles because Apollo guides the arrow. Ancient audiences accepted this as theology. The gods were real and did interfere in human affairs. But it also functioned psychologically. Sometimes you do everything right and still lose because forces beyond your control intervene. Sometimes fate simply happens. The gods are a way to acknowledge that life isn't entirely within our power to control. Modern readers might see in the gods representations of chance, systemic forces, the way individual choices are shaped by larger contexts. Either way, Troy teaches that we're not entirely masters of our fates. That context and luck and divine whim, call it what you will, matter as much as character and choice. The hollowness of victory is perhaps Troy's most powerful lesson. The Greeks won. They destroyed Troy, recovered Helen, fulfilled their oath. And what did they gain? Agamemnon was murdered. Odysseus wandered 10 more years. Ajax committed suicide. The fleet was scattered. Curses followed them home. Even Menelaus, who got Helen back, what did he really win? A wife who'd chosen, or been taken by another man. A decade lost. A marriage that could never be what it was. The war was Pyrrhic in every sense. Victory so costly it's indistinguishable from defeat. This pattern repeats throughout history. Wars fought for noble reasons that destroy the nobility of everyone involved. Victories that cost more than defeat would have. Conquests that hollow out the conqueror. Troy shows us this pattern in its purest form. Even winning can be losing if you sacrifice what matters in pursuit of victory. The story also teaches about the power of poetry over fact. The historical Troy, if there was one, was probably a minor conflict in the Bronze Age's chaotic end. But Homer's poetry transformed it into the foundational war narrative of Western culture. The facts don't matter as much as the truth the story captures about war, honour, loss, and human nature. That's deeply profound. Reality is chaotic, meaningless, random. Stories impose meaning, create patterns, teach lessons. The Trojan War as legend matters more than the Trojan War as historical event because the legend can be retold, reinterpreted, applied to new contexts. History happens once, mythology is eternal. Finally, Troy teaches us about memory and forgetting, about what cultures choose to preserve and why. We remember Achilles' rage but forget most Bronze Age economic systems. We remember Helen's face but forget the names of thousands who died. We remember the wooden horse but not the logistics of maintaining a 10-year siege. We remember what serves our narrative needs, the dramatic, the meaningful, the emotionally resonant. That selective memory reveals what we value, individual heroism over collective effort, dramatic moments over grinding persistence, moral questions over practical details. The Trojan War endures because it asks questions we keep asking. What's worth fighting for? What does honour mean? How do we survive catastrophe? What remains when everything burns? These aren't questions with definitive answers, which is precisely why we keep returning to Troy, finding new meanings in ancient ruins and immortal poetry. It's late now, wherever you are. Maybe you've been listening through your entire evening, through the rise and fall of Troy across these 15 parts. Maybe the sky outside your window is the same dark that covered Troy's ruins when the fires finally burned down to embers. We've travelled together from a wedding feast on Mount Pelion to smoking ruins on the Anatolian coast, from the gathering of heroes at Aulis to scattered survivors carrying fragments of memory across the Mediterranean. We've watched as pride, honour, desire and rage who combined to create the most famous war in Western culture, a war that may or may not have happened quite as described, but which happened in every way that matters. What strikes me most, having walked through this story again, is how utterly human it all is. Not the divine interventions or the heroic exaggerations, but beneath all that, the recognisable human responses to impossible situations. Hector kissing his wife and baby goodbye, knowing he's probably going to die but going anyway because duty demands it. Achilles weeping over Patroclus' body, his rage at having lost the person he loved most consuming everything else. Priam kneeling before his son's killer, begging for decency in the middle of horror. Andromache holding Astyanax, knowing what's coming, and powerless to prevent it. These moments transcend their Bronze Age setting. They're eternal human experiences. Loss, love, duty, grief, the impossible choices war forces on people. That's why Troy survives when so many other ancient stories have faded. It's specific, Greek warriors besieging an Anatolian city over a stolen queen, but also universal, about patterns and emotions that recur regardless of era or culture. The wooden horse has become our metaphor for deception disguised as gift. For the enemy you invite through your own gates by trusting the wrong thing. But it's also about exhaustion. Troy had withstood 10 years of siege. They wanted so desperately to believe it was over that they ignored every warning, broke their own walls, dragged in the instrument of their destruction. We do this, personally, culturally, politically. We want victory or relief so badly that we ignore warnings, choose comfortable lies over difficult truths. The aftermath, the scattered Greeks cursed on their journeys home, the enslaved Trojans adapting to new lives, the few who made it back finding everything changed, speaks to war's long tail. Conflicts don't end when the fighting stops. Trauma continues, consequences cascade. The veterans returning to civilian life struggle with what they've done and seen. The victors find their victory hollow. The survivors carry scars visible and invisible. But also, and this feels important to name, something does survive. Aeneas carrying his father on his back out of burning Troy is a beautiful image, because it's about salvaging what can be salvaged. When everything's lost, you save what you can. Family, memory, identity, dignity. And from those fragments, you rebuild. The Trojan refugees didn't recreate Troy somewhere else. That was impossible. But they carried Trojan identity forward, preserved stories, built new cities informed by but not imprisoned by what had been lost. That's a kind of victory over destruction. Not undoing the catastrophe, but refusing to be entirely defined by it. The story has been retold countless times across 3,000 years, each generation finding new meanings, new emphases, new lessons. Renaissance painters saw in Troy classical ideals to emulate. Romantic poets saw doomed beauty. Modernists saw war's futility. Feminists recovered women's voices. Post-colonial scholars examined power and narrative control. Each interpretation reveals something about the interpreters, while also finding genuine insights in the ancient story. This suggests something profound about great myths. They're not fixed objects, but living conversations. Troy means different things to different audiences because the story contains multitudes, enough complexity, enough humanity, enough moral ambiguity that each era can find its own concerns reflected back. Archaeological Troy, the actual ruins at Hisarlik, adds another layer. You can stand there now, look out over the plain where the Greek camp supposedly sat, see the Dardanelles in the distance, touch stones that might have been touched by people who lived through Bronze Age conflicts. That physical reality grounds the mythology without diminishing it. If anything, knowing there was a real city makes the poetry more poignant, not less. We've spent these 15 parts together, and I hope you found something in the journey. Maybe it's appreciation for Bronze Age warfare's complexity. Maybe it's insight into how heroic values can be both magnificent and terrible. Maybe it's the recognition of patterns, personal, political, cultural, that keep recurring. Maybe it's just the pleasure of a well-told story, even one that's 3 millennia old. For me, coming back to Troy is always about remembering that we're not the first people to face impossible choices, devastating losses, moral ambiguity and conflict. The Bronze Age Greeks and Trojans weren't different from us in any essential way. They loved their families, they valued honour and struggled with what that meant. They fought wars for reasons both noble and venal. They survived catastrophes or didn't. They told stories to make sense of senselessness. The story of Troy is ultimately about what remains when cities fall. And the answer is memory, stories, lessons, warnings. The physical city was destroyed thoroughly, burned, broken, eventually buried under centuries of accumulated earth. But the story survived, was told around fires and in palaces, was written down and copied, was translated and reinterpreted, survived the fall of its own civilization and multiple others after. That's its final lesson, perhaps. Stone can be broken, walls can be breached, cities can burn, but stories, if they're true in the ways that matter, if they speak to something essential about human experience, those can't be destroyed. They adapt, transform, endure. As you go back to your own life, whatever challenges you're facing, whatever walls you're defending or besieging, I hope Troy offers something useful. Maybe it's the reminder that we're not alone in struggling with impossible situations. Maybe it's the example of people like Hector who fought honourably despite knowing they'd lose. Maybe it's the warning about what happens when pride and rage overcome wisdom. Maybe it's simply the comfort of knowing that humans have been telling this story for 3,000 years because it helps us understand ourselves. Troy fell, but in falling it became immortal, preserved not in bronze or stone but in poetry and memory, in every retelling and reinterpretation, in the way each generation returns to the story looking for guidance, warning, or simply recognition of our own struggles in ancient ones. The fires that burned Troy have long since turned to ash, but the story still burns, bright as ever, lighting our way through the darkness we all face. Thank you for listening. I hope wherever you are in the world tonight, you find some peace in knowing we're all inheritors of these ancient stories, all connected by the need to understand ourselves through the myths we preserve. Sleep well, friend, and remember Troy, not as a warning against ever fighting, but as a reminder to be careful what we fight for, how we fight, what we're willing to destroy in pursuit of victory, and most importantly, what we choose to preserve when everything burns. Good night.